Night falls quietly over the city. Streetlights flicker on, cars pass in distant whispers, and the world slows into a rhythm meant for rest. This is the kind of night where stories linger longer, where the past feels closer, and where truth reveals itself without shouting. Tonight's story is not meant to glorify crime, but to understand it, to learn from it, and to leave behind a lesson that lasts longer than fear. John Alite's story begins far from the glamour often associated with organized crime. He was born into a working-class immigrant family, raised with strict values, discipline, and an understanding that survival required toughness. His early environment was not built on privilege, but on struggle. In neighborhoods where respect was earned through strength rather than words, young minds learned quickly that weakness invited danger. As a teenager, Alite gravitated toward people who appeared powerful. They were men who walked without fear, spoke with confidence, and commanded attention without asking for it. To an impressionable young man, they seemed like protectors in a world that offered little safety. What he did not yet understand was that this power came at a cost that could never truly be paid. Unlike many who stumble into crime through desperation, Alite was drawn by identity. He wanted to belong. He wanted structure. He wanted recognition. And in the shadows of organized crime, he found all three. The streets taught him lessons no school ever could. How silence mattered, how loyalty was currency, and how violence was a language understood by everyone. Over time, his reputation grew, not because he talked about himself, but because others talked about him. He became known as someone who could be relied upon when situations turned dangerous. In the underworld, reliability often meant a willingness to cross moral lines without hesitation. Each step deeper made turning back harder, until the road behind him disappeared completely. Alite eventually became associated with the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in American history. This was not a title handed out lightly. It meant trust, but also constant scrutiny. Every move was watched. Every word was remembered. In this world, mistakes were permanent. Unlike traditional made men bound by old world rules, Alite existed in a gray area. Respected, feared, but never fully protected by tradition. This made him both dangerous and vulnerable. He operated with a sense of independence that set him apart. But that same independence would later become a source of conflict. The life of a mob soldier is not what movies portray. There are no constant celebrations, no endless rewards. Instead, there is paranoia, pressure, and an unspoken understanding that loyalty is tested daily. One wrong decision can end everything: freedom, family, life itself. Alite witnessed firsthand how power corrupted even those who believed they controlled it. He saw friends disappear, alliances collapse, and promises break without warning. The code that once seemed unbreakable began to show cracks. Respect turned transactional. Trust became temporary. Survival replaced honor. As violence escalated around him, so did internal conflict. Each action carried consequences that followed him home at night. Sleep became shallow. Peace became rare. The realization slowly emerged that the life he chose was consuming everything else: family ties, future possibilities, and any sense of normalcy. What makes Alite's story different is not just the crimes, but the crossroads he eventually faced. In a world where silence was sacred, he began to question whether loyalty to criminals was worth the lifelong cost. This internal struggle marked the beginning of a transformation that would challenge the very foundation of organized crime values. The decision to defy the Mafia code is not made in a moment. It grows quietly, shaped by fear, regret, and an awareness that the path ahead leads only to prison or death. Alite understood that survival sometimes requires breaking the rules that once defined you, but defiance comes with consequences far worse than punishment from the law. It means becoming a target. It means living with the weight of choices that cannot be undone. And it means accepting responsibility for everything done in the name of loyalty. This chapter of the story is not about redemption yet. It is about understanding how a man becomes trapped inside a system built on violence, how identity replaces morality, and how power disguises destruction. It is a reminder that crime does not begin with evil intentions. It often begins with misplaced trust and the desire to belong. As the night deepens and the city grows quieter, remember this: every choice builds a future, whether we see it or not. The path John Alite walked was shaped by moments that seemed small at the time, but together formed a life that demanded a heavy price. This is only the beginning of a long and complex journey, one filled with loyalty, betrayal, fear, and ultimately truth. The deeper a person moves into the criminal world, the quieter everything becomes. Not because life grows peaceful, but because noise becomes dangerous. Words are measured. Faces are studied. Every interaction carries hidden meaning. This was the environment where John Alite's life continued to unfold, shaped by pressure rather than choice. By this stage, his name carried weight. Not the kind that brought admiration, but the kind that caused rooms to fall silent. People noticed when he entered. They adjusted how they spoke, how they stood, how they breathed. Fear and respect often looked the same, and in this world, they were rarely separated. Violence was no longer shocking. It became procedural. Decisions were made quickly, followed by actions that could not be undone. What once felt extreme began to feel routine. This is how criminal behavior embeds itself into identity, not through excitement, but through normalization. Money flowed more easily now, but it never stayed. Fast cash creates fast problems. The more someone earns illegally, the more they owe to associates, to expectations, to a lifestyle that demands constant feeding. Luxury was never security. It only increased exposure. Trust, once given freely, became selective. Even longtime allies were watched carefully. A glance held meaning. Silence spoke louder than words. Everyone understood that loyalty had limits, and survival came first. Betrayal was not considered immoral. It was considered strategic. Alite operated with discipline, but discipline alone could not shield him from the chaos around him. Arguments escalated quickly. Disputes were settled through intimidation, not negotiation. In this environment, control was an illusion maintained through fear. What outsiders rarely understand is that criminal organizations consume their own. The same system that elevates individuals eventually destroys them. Power creates enemies, and enemies create paranoia. Every success invites scrutiny. Every failure invites punishment. As his responsibilities increased, so did the consequences of hesitation. There was no room for doubt. Decisions had to be immediate, even when they carried irreversible outcomes. The emotional cost was buried, ignored, or numbed, but never erased. Sleep became lighter. Awareness sharpened. The body remained alert even at rest, conditioned by years of unpredictability. This constant tension wears down the mind. It transforms ordinary moments into potential threats. Peace becomes unfamiliar. Family life suffered silently. Distance grew not through arguments, but through absence. Being present physically did not mean being present emotionally. The world he lived in required emotional detachment. Caring too much was a liability. Despite the reputation he carried, moments of reflection crept in unexpectedly, late at night, in quiet rooms, in the aftermath of action that could not be justified away. The realization formed slowly. This life did not reward loyalty the way it promised. Rules existed, but they shifted depending on who held power. Justice was selective. Consequences were uneven. Those at the top survived mistakes that destroyed those below. This imbalance became impossible to ignore. The myth of brotherhood began to collapse. Alliances dissolved when pressure increased. Promises meant nothing when self-preservation was threatened. The code that claimed to value honor revealed itself as conditional. Alite observed how quickly respect turned into suspicion. One rumor could undo years of service. One accusation could invite irreversible consequences. The margin for error disappeared completely. Violence was no longer a tool, it was an expectation. Refusal was interpreted as weakness. Compliance was interpreted as obedience. There was no winning, only delaying the inevitable. What haunted him most was not fear of law enforcement, but the realization that this world offered no future. Aging was not permitted. Retirement was not respected. Survival had an expiration date. He saw what awaited those who stayed too long: prison cells, unmarked graves, or lives spent looking over one's shoulder. The illusion of control shattered completely. This was the stage where internal conflict intensified. Not regret yet. Awareness. Awareness that the path forward led nowhere new. Awareness that the system demanded more, while offering less. Awareness that identity had been built on something fundamentally unstable. The mind begins to change before actions do. Questions replace certainty. Silence becomes heavy. Loyalty becomes conditional. These shifts are invisible to others, but they reshape everything internally. Alite understood that survival would require an impossible choice: continue forward and accept the consequences, or break away and face an entirely different kind of danger. Both paths carried risk. Neither offered peace. This chapter of the story is about pressure, the kind that builds slowly until escape feels like the only remaining option. It is about understanding how power traps those who seek it, and how systems built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. Crime promises control but delivers captivity. It offers respect but demands obedience. It rewards loyalty temporarily, then punishes it permanently. As the night deepens, this story reminds us of a universal truth. When a life is built on intimidation, it eventually becomes ruled by it. And when identity is shaped by violence, escape requires more courage than entry ever did. The path ahead grows darker, more dangerous, and more decisive from here. There comes a point in every dangerous life where momentum replaces intention. Decisions are no longer made carefully, they are made because stopping feels impossible. This was the phase where the rhythm of violence, secrecy, and obligation moved faster than reflection, carrying everything forward whether anyone was ready or not. The criminal world thrives on escalation. What once required justification soon required expectation. Acts that were once rare became common, and common actions lost their emotional weight. This is not because conscience disappears, but because survival demands silence from it. The mind adapts in ways it was never meant to. In this environment, reputation became armor. It protected against challenge, but it also invited conflict. Strength discouraged threats, yet it attracted rivals who wanted to test it. Every display of dominance planted the seed for future confrontation. Power did not bring clarity. It brought isolation. Fewer people spoke honestly. Conversations became layered with intention. Compliments felt calculated. Advice felt strategic. Authenticity vanished, replaced by performance. Daily life required constant awareness. Every vehicle behind could be a warning. Every unexpected phone call carried potential consequence. Trusting instincts became essential, but even instincts could be manipulated by paranoia. The financial rewards continued, but they felt hollow. Money solved surface problems while deepening invisible ones. It built walls instead of stability. It created separation rather than security. Wealth without legitimacy offered no protection from consequence. The criminal structure demanded availability at all times. Personal boundaries dissolved. Family obligations were interrupted. Personal milestones were missed. Absence became normal and normality faded quietly. What haunted the quiet moments was not fear of punishment, but awareness of transformation. The person who entered this world no longer existed. Replaced was someone harder, colder, and less patient. Identity had shifted slowly, unnoticed, until it felt permanent. Conflict intensified from within the system itself. Disagreements grew sharper. Power struggle surfaced. Alliances fractured. Authority was challenged subtly, then openly. The illusion of unity collapsed under pressure. Respect was enforced, not earned. Fear maintained order temporarily, but resentment accumulated beneath the surface. The system relied on intimidation to function, but intimidation ensured eventual rebellion. Alite navigated this environment with precision, but precision could not prevent inevitability. The margin for survival narrowed with every passing year. Each action layered consequence upon consequence until escape seemed mathematically impossible. There were moments when the cost became undeniable. Witnessing outcomes that could not be undone. Seeing how quickly life ended when someone was deemed inconvenient. Understanding that loyalty did not guarantee protection. The criminal code claimed to value silence, respect, and honor. In practice, it rewarded ambition and punished vulnerability. Those who questioned direction were removed. Those who hesitated were replaced. Mental exhaustion set in quietly. Hyper-awareness drained energy. Emotional suppression created distance from everything that once mattered. Peace felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. The body reacted before the mind acknowledged it. Tension lingered, sleep fractured. Calm moments felt temporary. The nervous system remained locked in defense mode, unable to reset. In private moments, questions formed without answers. How long could this continue? What was the endgame? Who truly benefited from this structure? These questions were dangerous not because they were wrong, but because they weakened commitment. The realization emerged that the system offered no exit strategy. Advancement ended at survival. Aging brought vulnerability. Experience brought scrutiny rather than respect. Alite saw how quickly roles reversed. Those who once gave orders became liabilities. Influence faded without warning. History offered no immunity. The criminal world depended on loyalty, yet it punished loyalty when it conflicted with self-interest. This contradiction sat at the core of everything. Awareness does not immediately lead to change. It leads to conflict. The internal struggle between identity and survival intensified. The recognition that remaining meant destruction, but leaving meant exposure. The fear of consequences on both sides created paralysis. Action felt dangerous, inaction felt fatal. The space between narrowed relentlessly. What separated survival from collapse was timing. Acting too early invited retaliation. Acting too late ensured capture. Every calculation carried risk. This phase of life was defined by waiting for clarity, waiting for opportunity, waiting for a moment that justified movement. The waiting itself became exhausting. What outsiders never see is how crime drains meaning from everything. Victories feel temporary. Losses feel permanent. The future feels closed. The system that promised power now demanded obedience. Individuality became a threat. Independence became dangerous. Compliance became survival. The internal shift continued quietly. Loyalty was no longer emotional, it was transactional. Trust was replaced by caution. Faith in the system dissolved completely. This story at this moment is not about action, but about awareness. About the stage where understanding replaces illusion, where survival requires confronting truths that were once ignored. Crime does not collapse suddenly. It erodes slowly. It convinces people they are in control while stripping control away piece by piece. As the night grows deeper, this chapter leaves us with a quiet truth. The most dangerous prisons are not built with walls, but with choices repeated long enough to feel irreversible. What comes next will require a decision that reshapes everything. There is a moment in dangerous lives when movement becomes unavoidable. Not because clarity arrives, but because pressure closes in from every side. The air feels heavier. Options feel narrower. Silence begins to sound like a warning instead of protection. This phase unfolded without drama at first. No sudden confrontation. No dramatic turning point. Just a steady tightening of circumstances. Expectations increased while patience disappeared. Every interaction felt examined. Every delay felt suspicious. Authority within the criminal structure shifted constantly. Power changed hands quietly, often without announcement. Those who once gave direction were replaced by others who demanded obedience without explanation. Stability dissolved, replaced by uncertainty. In this environment, control was maintained through unpredictability. People were kept off balance intentionally. Fear worked best when rules were unclear. When consequences felt random, compliance increased. Alite understood this instinctively. Survival required adaptation. But adaptation came at a cost. Each adjustment meant surrendering a piece of independence. Each compromise eroded identity. Communication became coded. Conversations carried double meanings. Trust existed only momentarily, then disappeared. Even familiar faces felt distant. Familiar places felt unsafe. The line between ally and adversary blurred. Personal history no longer guaranteed loyalty. Reputation alone determined treatment. One misstep could redefine everything. The psychological toll deepened. Constant vigilance drained energy. Rest never felt complete. The body remained alert, anticipating threat even in quiet moments. This state was not sustainable, but stepping away felt impossible. Opportunities appeared and vanished without warning. Promises were made, then quietly withdrawn. Decisions were delayed intentionally to test patience. Pressure was applied to observe reactions. What became clear was that value within the system was temporary. Defined worth. Once usefulness declined, protection vanished. The system did not reward longevity. It exploited it. This realization created a shift, not outwardly, internally. A recalibration of expectation, a quiet understanding that survival required distance, not deeper involvement. But distance itself was dangerous. Withdrawal invited suspicion. Reduced visibility raised questions. Every action had to appear natural, even when intentions changed. The challenge was not leaving, but appearing unchanged while preparing for transformation. This required restraint greater than violence ever demanded. Silence became strategy. Patience became defense. The criminal environment thrived on reaction. Those who reacted revealed weakness. Those who remained controlled preserved options. Alite maintained composure even as internal pressure intensified. Moments of clarity arrived unexpectedly. Watching how quickly loyalty dissolved under stress, seeing how authority protected itself at the expense of everyone else. Understanding that sacrifice flowed in one direction only. The realization hardened into certainty. This structure consumed people completely. It demanded everything in return, nothing permanent. Survival required breaking alignment with it. But breaking alignment came with fear greater than confrontation. It meant standing alone. It meant accepting uncertainty. It meant becoming visible in a different way. Fear is not weakness. Fear is information. And the information was clear. Remaining carried guaranteed destruction. Leaving carried risk, but also possibility. Preparation began quietly. Not through planning crimes, but through minimizing exposure, limiting unnecessary interactions, avoiding conflict, observing patterns rather than participating in them. The criminal world noticed change quickly. Reduced involvement drew attention. Questions surfaced subtly. Pressure returned, testing loyalty. Alite navigated this phase carefully, appearing compliant while withholding commitment, present without being engaged, visible without being vulnerable. The strain of this balance was immense. One miscalculation could trigger consequences that could not be reversed. Timing mattered more than intention. The emotional weight increased. Guilt surfaced, not only for actions taken but for recognizing their permanence. The awareness that harm could not be undone, only acknowledged. This awareness did not bring peace. It brought responsibility. Responsibility for outcomes. Responsibility for choices. Responsibility for whatever came next. The criminal code discouraged reflection. Reflection weakened obedience. Yet reflection could not be suppressed forever. The mind demanded resolution. Every environment has a breaking point. This one approached steadily. Tensions escalated. Conflicts intensified. Trust evaporated entirely. What once felt controlled now felt volatile. What once felt predictable now felt chaotic. The system was eating itself. Alite understood that waiting for collapse was dangerous. Collapses crushed those inside them. Escape required action before collapse occurred. But action demanded courage beyond physical strength. It required abandoning identity built over years. It required accepting judgment. It required stepping into uncertainty without protection. This stage of life tested resolve more than any confrontation ever had. Violence was simple compared to transformation. Confrontation was easier than withdrawal. What sustained him was clarity, not hope. Clarity, the understanding that continuing meant loss without end, the understanding that survival demanded change. This chapter is about restraint, about holding still while everything urges reaction, about choosing patience in a world that rewards impulse. Crime thrives on urgency. Escape requires calm. As the night deepens, the lesson becomes clear. True strength is not measured by fear imposed on others, but by the courage to walk away from systems built to destroy. The moment of decision draws closer. There is a kind of silence that does not feel peaceful. It feels loaded, as if the air itself is waiting. This silence surrounded every movement now, every pause between conversations, every decision delayed just long enough to be noticed. The world had narrowed into a careful balancing act where one wrong step could undo everything. Life continued on the surface. Meetings still happened. Conversations still took place. Smiles still appeared where they were expected. But underneath, tension pressed constantly, shaping every thought. Survival depended on appearing unchanged while knowing that nothing was the same. The criminal environment had entered a phase of heightened instability. Power struggles intensified quietly. Authority figures competed for influence. Decisions were questioned more openly. Confidence was replaced by aggression. Control was asserted through pressure rather than respect. In this atmosphere, neutrality became dangerous. Those who did not choose sides were viewed as liabilities. Silence was interpreted as resistance. Caution was mistaken for defiance. This system demanded visible loyalty. Alite understood the risk immediately. Visibility now mattered more than action. Being present was no longer enough. Participation was expected. Commitment had to be demonstrated repeatedly. But commitment carried consequences. Each visible act tied identity tighter to a structure already cracking. Each step forward reduced the possibility of stepping away later. The stress was relentless. Mental exhaustion compounded physical fatigue. The mind never fully disengaged. Even moments of rest felt temporary. interrupted by instinctive alertness. This was the stage where fear became constant but not overwhelming. It sharpened perception. It filtered distractions. It clarified priorities. Fear, when acknowledged, became a guide rather than a weakness. The guiding truth was clear. Remaining fully embedded would eventually result in irreversible outcomes. The system no longer protected its own. It consumed them when convenient. Preparation continued quietly, not through drastic moves but through subtle adjustments, reducing exposure, limiting unnecessary involvement, observing rather than engaging, listening more than speaking. The challenge was timing. Acting too soon invited retaliation. Acting too late invited entrapment. The margin for error shrank daily. Social dynamics shifted. Conversations felt colder. Interactions felt transactional. Trust was no longer assumed, only temporarily extended. Alite noticed how quickly attitudes changed when power shifted. Those who once showed respect became distant. Those who once relied on him now measured him carefully. Loyalty revealed its limits. The realization deepened. This world did not value people, only utility. Once usefulness declined, replacement was immediate. History did not matter. Sacrifice did not matter. This understanding stripped away any remaining illusions. What remained was clarity. The path forward would be difficult, but staying was no longer an option. Internal conflict intensified. Leaving meant facing consequences from multiple directions. Staying meant surrendering autonomy completely. Both carried risk, but only one allowed the possibility of survival beyond fear. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily. Responsibility for actions taken. Responsibility for harm caused. Responsibility for what would come next. This was not about justification. It was about accountability. Acknowledging reality without denial. The criminal world discouraged introspection. Introspection weakened obedience, yet it could not be suppressed entirely. The mind demanded resolution. Moments of quiet reflection became more frequent, late at night, in isolated spaces, in the absence of distraction. These moments carried clarity without comfort. The realization was sobering. Violence had not provided control, only temporary leverage. Power had not created security, only visibility. Loyalty had not ensured protection, only obligation. The system's promises had expired. What remained was choice. But choice in this world was dangerous. Exercising it openly invited consequences. Exercising it secretly required patience and discipline. The body reacted to the prolonged stress. Tension settled into muscles. Sleep fragmented. Calm felt unnatural. The nervous system remained primed for threat. Yet within this strain, resolve strengthened. The understanding that survival required courage of a different kind than physical confrontation. Courage to disengage. Courage to accept uncertainty. Courage to abandon an identity that no longer served life. This stage tested emotional endurance more than physical strength ever had. Violence demanded impulse. Transformation demanded restraint. Every day felt like walking across unstable ground. Each interaction required calculation. Each silence required interpretation. The criminal environment sensed change instinctively. Systems built on fear detect hesitation. Pressure increased subtly. Expectations were reiterated. Boundaries were tested. Alite responded with control, calm responses, measured reactions. No visible resistance. No visible compliance beyond necessity. This balance required constant awareness. One lapse could expose intention. One emotional response could invite scrutiny. The waiting continued, waiting for alignment, waiting for opportunity, waiting for a moment where action became unavoidable. This waiting was not passive. It was strategic. It was preparation through observation, learning patterns, understanding timing. What sustained him was not optimism, but acceptance. Acceptance that consequences were inevitable. Acceptance that avoidance was temporary. Acceptance that responsibility would eventually be faced. This acceptance brought a strange calm, not peace, but steadiness. A readiness to move when the moment arrived. The criminal world thrives on chaos. Escape requires patience. This chapter is about endurance, about surviving the most dangerous phase, the space between awareness and action, where fear and clarity coexist, where identity dissolves before transformation begins. As the night deepens, the lesson emerges quietly. True power is not dominance over others, but the ability to step away from systems that destroy everything they touch. The moment of movement approaches. There is a phase in dangerous lives where movement begins quietly, almost invisibly. Not through dramatic actions, but through subtle shifts in behavior that signal internal change long before the outside world notices. This phase demands discipline, restraint, and the ability to endure uncertainty without revealing intent. Daily routines continued, but priorities shifted. Every action was measured for exposure. Every interaction was evaluated for risk. The focus was no longer on advancement or recognition, but on preservation. Survival became the central objective, replacing ambition entirely. The criminal environment remained volatile. Tensions flared unpredictably. Conflicts surfaced and disappeared without resolution. Authority felt temporary, constantly challenged by ambition and fear. Stability was an illusion maintained by intimidation. Alite navigated this environment carefully, understanding that appearances mattered more than explanation. Reduced involvement had to look natural. Distance had to appear circumstantial rather than intentional. Any sign of withdrawal invited suspicion. This required constant emotional control. No visible frustration. No visible hesitation. Reactions were neutral, controlled, deliberate. The ability to remain unreadable became essential. What made this phase especially dangerous was the loss of trust on all sides. Allies questioned motives. Rivals searched for weakness. Silence was no longer neutral. It was interpreted. The criminal structure depended on participation to function. Those who disengaged disrupted the balance. Disruption was not tolerated. The pressure to recommit intensified subtly. Expectations were reinforced. Loyalty was tested indirectly. Situations were created to observe responses. Every test carried consequence. Refusal risked confrontation. Compliance risked deeper entanglement. The balance grew increasingly fragile. Internally, resolve hardened. The recognition that remaining fully involved guaranteed destruction removed hesitation. Fear remained, but it no longer dictated direction. Clarity replaced uncertainty. Preparation continued through observation. Patterns emerged. Behaviors repeated. Predictability surfaced beneath chaos. Even volatile systems follow routines. Understanding these routines created opportunity. Timing became clearer. Risks became calculable. Movement began to feel possible. The cost of staying visible grew heavier. The cost of leaving remained unknown, but unknown no longer felt worse than certain collapse. Emotional detachment deepened. Not from humanity, but from the criminal identity that had defined daily life. The separation between self and role widened quietly. This detachment brought grief. Grief for wasted time. Grief for lost relationships. Grief for harm caused that could not be undone. Acknowledging this grief was painful, but necessary. Avoiding it would have kept him trapped. Facing it created movement. The criminal world discourages accountability. Accountability weakens loyalty, yet accountability became unavoidable. Accepting responsibility without justification marked a turning point. This acceptance did not erase fear. It redirected it. Fear of consequence became motivation for change rather than paralysis. The body reflected the strain. Fatigue lingered. Sleep remained fragmented. Calm moments felt unfamiliar, yet endurance strengthened. The environment sensed instability instinctively. Pressure increased again. Expectations tightened. Boundaries were tested more aggressively. Alite maintained composure. The calm response frustrated attempts to provoke reaction. Control became a shield. The waiting intensified. Not passive waiting, but readiness. Awareness sharpened. Opportunities were recognized quickly. Hesitation decreased. The realization emerged that action would not arrive cleanly or safely. There would be no perfect moment. Only a moment less dangerous than the rest. This understanding eliminated delay. Preparation shifted toward readiness rather than planning. The criminal system relies on hesitation. Those who hesitate can be controlled. Those who move decisively disrupt the structure. Movement began internally before any external action. Commitment solidified. Identity shifted fully away from the criminal role. This internal alignment brought steadiness. Fear remained, but clarity guided behavior. The environment grew increasingly unstable. Conflicts escalated, pressure mounted, consequences loomed closer. This was the stage where survival demanded courage different from confrontation. Courage to accept exposure. Courage to accept judgment. Courage to face outcomes directly. The realization was simple and heavy. There was no way forward without consequence. The only choice was which consequence to face. Choosing accountability over collapse became inevitable. This chapter is about readiness, about the quiet strength required to stand still while everything urges reaction, about preparing for transformation without revealing it prematurely. Crime thrives on impulsive loyalty. Escape requires deliberate restraint. As the night deepens, the lesson becomes clear. The most difficult battles are not fought with fists or weapons, but within the mind, where fear and clarity compete for control. The threshold of action draws near. The city was quiet, but the quiet was deceptive. Every corner held unseen eyes, every street carried invisible pressures, and every encounter could change the course of a life measured in seconds. In such a world, even small decisions mattered far more than they should have, and the margin for error was thinner than a whisper. John Alite understood this deeply. Every step he took was calculated, every word he spoke measured. It was no longer about reputation, power, or control. It was about preserving the most valuable thing left, choice. Each moment offered the opportunity to maintain it or lose it entirely, and the weight of that reality was relentless. The criminal environment was increasingly unpredictable. Loyalties shifted without warning. Alliances that had seemed unshakable cracked under pressure. Those who had previously commanded respect now navigated suspicion. Authority was temporary, and security was always an illusion. In such circumstances, observation became as important as action, and patience became a weapon more powerful than aggression. Alite had learned the subtle language of survival. He could read hesitation as clearly as he could read anger. Silence often spoke louder than words. One glance, one inflection, could reveal intentions far more accurately than statements ever could. Understanding these hidden currents allowed him to anticipate danger and navigate around it before it arrived. Yet, awareness alone was not enough. The cost of staying visible in the criminal structure continued to rise. Every act of compliance tied him tighter to a world that was beginning to feel like a trap. Every interaction created new obligations, each more dangerous than the last. The balance between participation and withdrawal was delicate. One misstep could undo years of careful navigation. In this environment, fear was constant, but it had changed character. It was no longer the fear of punishment alone. It was fear shaped by understanding. Fear of what relentless systems do to those who fail, of how quickly trust can dissolve, of how easily identity can be consumed by expectation. This fear, however, no longer paralyzed, it guided. It clarified. It refined every decision. Alite's awareness extended to the subtle ways people tested him. Unspoken challenges arose in ordinary moments. A question phrased innocuously, a request for information, a casual observation that was actually a measure of loyalty. These were the unseen pressures that defined the daily experience. Responding correctly required a combination of calm, strategy, and timing, and any error could have profound consequences. Financial reward, though present, no longer felt valuable. Money solved temporary problems, but it created others. Every gain increased visibility. Every transaction created potential exposure. Wealth did not protect, it attracted. The more successful one appeared, the higher the stakes became. In this system, the safest position was often the least visible one. Internal conflict grew steadily. Actions taken for survival, obedience, or necessity weighed heavily. Each decision carried consequences that rippled outward, affecting family, allies, and even personal integrity. The more Alite considered the outcomes, the more he understood that the real danger was not external, it was the slow erosion of the self. When morality is constantly compromised, the mind learns to compromise instinctively, and identity becomes an echo of obligation rather than choice. At the same time, opportunities for action emerged. Movement towards safety or autonomy did not present itself in grand gestures, but in subtle openings. Observing routines, identifying predictable behaviors, understanding who would act first under pressure, these small insights became the keys to gaining control without drawing attention. Each insight required patience, discipline, and an understanding that visibility could equal danger. The challenge was executing action while maintaining safety. Acting prematurely invited retaliation. Waiting too long risked exposure. Timing became the most valuable skill, surpassing physical strength, influence, or intelligence. The ability to wait, watch, and act decisively when conditions were optimal, defined survival in ways outsiders rarely comprehend. Even in the midst of these pressures, moments of reflection emerged. Quiet nights offered a rare opportunity to consider consequences, to acknowledge fear without panic, and to weigh the moral cost of continued involvement. These reflections were uncomfortable because they revealed truth that had been ignored: the hollowness of respect based on fear, the fleeting nature of power built on coercion, and the inevitability of personal loss if remaining in the system. Emotion, though suppressed, remained present. Guilt and awareness coexisted with self-preservation, creating a psychological tension that required careful management. The key was not to eliminate these emotions, but to channel them. They became indicators of risk, motivators for caution, and guides for timing. Understanding oneself in relation to danger became more important than understanding others. Alite's preparation extended beyond personal survival to strategic disengagement. Observation became tactical. Patterns of behavior were studied. Every routine, every tendency, every expectation became part of a mental map of opportunity. This map allowed him to move without unnecessary exposure, to anticipate outcomes, and to position himself for eventual independence from the system. The criminal structure, however, was unforgiving. It punished hesitation, disloyalty, and unpredictability, even when the individual maintained appearances of compliance. Subtle shifts in attitude or behavior could trigger tests, traps, or challenges. Every day required a balance of engagement and detachment, of visibility and discretion. Physical and mental strain accumulated. Sleep remained shallow. Relaxation felt foreign. The body remained attuned to threat, conditioned by years of tension. Stress was not just psychological, it was physiological, altering reflexes, perception, and decision-making. Yet these adaptations, though taxing, became survival tools, enhancing alertness and response time. The internal struggle continued alongside the external pressures. The desire for safety, freedom, and moral integrity battled against loyalty, fear, and obligation. The tension was constant, yet it was not paralyzing. Instead, it refined decisions, sharpened instincts, and clarified priorities. Action was no longer impulsive, it was deliberate, calculated, and purposeful. As circumstances shifted, the importance of emotional discipline became more evident. Reactions could not betray intention. Facial expressions, tone of voice, and gestures were all controlled, calibrated, and carefully measured. Misinterpretation could be fatal. Control over oneself became more valuable than control over others. Through it all, clarity emerged. The system could not provide safety, stability, or lasting respect. Survival required moving beyond it. Power was illusory. Loyalty was temporary. Fear and obligation governed everything. The only path that preserved the self was carefully planned disengagement, executed with patience, precision, and awareness. This stage marked a turning point. Internal alignment, preparation, and observation had positioned him for decisive action. External conditions were increasingly favorable for measured steps, though risk remained. The skills developed over years, awareness, timing, patience, emotional control, would now determine the possibility of independence and long-term survival. This chapter is about anticipation and readiness, about recognizing the limits of a dangerous system and preparing to navigate them without losing control, about understanding that true courage is not displayed in confrontation, but in patience, discipline, and strategic foresight. As the night deepened, one lesson became clear: survival is not measured by dominance or aggression. It is measured by the ability to act with clarity, to control fear, and to move decisively when the right opportunity emerges. The threshold of transformation draws near. The city at night has a rhythm of its own, one that whispers in shadows, hums along empty streets, and pulses behind every closed door. For someone like John Alite, who had spent years navigating the invisible currents of power and fear, the night offered clarity that daylight often obscured. It was in these quiet hours that the mind could measure risk, assess strategy, and confront the truths that daylight demands we ignore. Life within the criminal structure had grown increasingly demanding. Every conversation carried weight. Every movement, however routine, could be scrutinized. A single lapse in attention could invite consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated. The environment demanded constant vigilance, yet the most dangerous threats often came from the subtle, almost imperceptible pressures that built up quietly over time. Alite had learned to read these pressures, to anticipate them, and to respond in ways that preserved his most essential asset, freedom of choice. He understood that remaining fully immersed meant surrendering autonomy, and that withdrawal, though risky, offered the possibility of survival and integrity. But the path to disengagement required more than boldness. It required strategy, patience, and a level of discipline few could maintain under constant stress. Visibility had become the most dangerous factor. Remaining seen without engagement drew scrutiny. Over-participation created entanglement. Reduced presence invited questions. Each adjustment in behavior was a calculated move along a tightrope stretched over a canyon of potential exposure. Balancing engagement and detachment required observation sharper than intuition and restraint stronger than impulse. This period was marked by the quiet accumulation of knowledge. Patterns emerged in how people reacted under pressure. Habits revealed themselves in subtle gestures and repetitive behavior. Even the most volatile environments have rules, and those who observed carefully could learn to anticipate outcomes and protect themselves. Alite became a master of reading these patterns, understanding not just what was being done but why, and using that understanding to maintain control over the space he occupied without fully surrendering to it. The cost of observation was high. Mental strain accumulated in ways that few outside could comprehend. Sleep became fragmented, often shallow, interrupted by instinctive awareness of potential threats. Emotional tension weighed heavily, pressing down on every decision. Yet in this tension, a form of clarity developed. The ability to discern risk, measure consequence, and anticipate danger became second nature. Financial reward was no longer a measure of success, only a source of additional risk. Wealth in the criminal system increased visibility and invited scrutiny, often from those who might previously have been allies. Money, which once seemed a shield, had revealed itself as a magnet for trouble. The realization was bitter. No material gain could replace safety, stability, or integrity. Everything else was temporary. Internal reflection grew unavoidable. The mind began to question not only actions taken but the moral cost of continued involvement. Each compromise, each act of loyalty enforced through fear left a mark that could not be erased. Guilt and awareness intertwined with survival instincts, creating a tension that sharpened judgment and informed strategy. Recognizing the consequences of past decisions became a guide for future choices. Opportunities for strategic movement began to present themselves, but they required patience. There would be no dramatic moment of revelation or sudden opening. The world does not operate in alignment with desire or expectation. Change required careful timing, precise execution, and the ability to act without alerting others prematurely. Each observation, each piece of information, became part of a larger plan, assembled quietly, deliberately, and with discipline. Physical strain mirrored mental strain. The body remained alert, muscles coiled, senses attuned to the faintest indicators of danger. Sleep was brief, but it honed the instincts necessary for survival. Fatigue became a constant companion, yet it also became a tool, keeping the mind sharp and responsive. Endurance was now as important as intelligence or courage. The pressures of engagement and withdrawal demanded emotional control beyond what had been required in previous years. One misjudged reaction could invite suspicion. One unintended expression could expose intent. Every interaction was a test, and the stakes were life-altering. Emotional mastery, more than physical capability, became the defining skill of survival. Alite began to see clearly illusions of power within the system. Respect, once assumed to be earned, was fleeting. Loyalty was conditional, based on circumstance rather than principle. Authority was enforced through fear, not trust. The system rewarded utility and punished deviation. The truth was stark. Survival required stepping outside the framework entirely. This recognition shifted priorities. Immediate survival remained essential, but long-term preservation became the goal. Preparation, observation, and timing became tools for disengagement rather than dominance. Strategy replaced impulse. Patience replaced aggression. Action would come, but only under conditions calculated to minimize risk. The criminal environment, however, never allowed complacency. Tests emerged in subtle forms. Questions were asked to measure response. Minor provocations assessed loyalty. Silence itself could be interpreted as resistance. Maintaining equilibrium required constant recalibration, ensuring that every action appeared natural while protecting the intent of independence. The mental discipline required was immense. Every thought had to be considered carefully, every word chosen deliberately, every interaction evaluated not only for immediate consequence but for the potential chain reaction it might create. This cognitive vigilance consumed energy, yet it was essential. Survival depended on it. Moments of quiet reflection became increasingly significant. Alone in the night, away from observation, Alite confronted not only the practical realities of his situation, but also the moral and emotional truths of a life lived under fear and obligation. These reflections clarified the necessity of moving beyond the system, highlighting that continued participation offered no future, only prolonged risk and moral compromise. The process of preparation for change continued quietly. Observation remained paramount. Opportunities were identified through careful study of patterns and behaviors. Timing became increasingly precise. Every factor, from daily routines to interpersonal dynamics, was considered in a comprehensive strategy designed to preserve choice and ensure safety when action became necessary. This stage of life demanded endurance and resilience. Physical and mental strain, emotional tension, and moral reckoning all combined to create a crucible. Yet from this crucible emerged clarity, the recognition that freedom, integrity, and survival required deliberate, strategic disengagement. The courage needed was not in confrontation, but in patient preparation, restraint, and disciplined action. As the night deepened, the lesson emerged clearly. The most important battles are not fought with fists or weapons. They are fought within the mind, where awareness, patience, and discipline determine whether survival is possible. The ultimate strength lies in the ability to control fear, observe opportunity, and act decisively when conditions allow. The threshold of change draws nearer, and every action, every observation, every choice now carries the weight of transformation. The path forward is uncertain, but clarity has been earned, and preparation has created the possibility for true independence. The night was still, but stillness carried weight. In the shadows of the city, the hum of life continued unnoticed by most, but for someone attuned to danger, every sound mattered. Steps echoed differently. Cars slowed on streets not normally traveled. Even the wind seemed to carry messages to those willing to listen. In this environment, survival was as much about perception as action. John Alite had learned that the criminal world was unpredictable, not because it lacked rules, but because the rules were invisible and enforced inconsistently. What seemed safe one day could become dangerous the next. Authority shifted subtly. Loyalties were conditional. Power could change hands without warning. A single misstep, even one barely noticeable, could trigger consequences that rippled far beyond what anyone expected. Visibility remained a constant danger. Remaining too engaged drew attention, but pulling away invited suspicion. Balancing presence and discretion had become a high-stakes game. Every interaction had to appear casual. Every movement had to feel natural. Timing, subtlety, and emotional control were paramount. One error could undo years of careful navigation. Observation became the most powerful tool. Patterns in behavior, subtle gestures, repeated routines all became vital pieces of information. Alite had honed the ability to anticipate reactions, predict outcomes, and position himself advantageously without creating friction. This skill allowed him to maintain autonomy, preserving the possibility of freedom without immediately revealing intent to others who might seek to enforce compliance. The cost of living under constant vigilance was profound. Fatigue was more than physical, it was psychological. The mind remained alert, processing potential threats even during moments that seemed ordinary. Emotional strain accumulated silently, shaping decisions and coloring interactions. Yet in this tension, clarity emerged. Fear was a guide, not a prison. It illuminated risk and highlighted opportunities. Financial reward was increasingly irrelevant. Wealth brought visibility, but no protection. It attracted scrutiny and envy. In a system where loyalty could shift at the slightest provocation, resources became liabilities rather than advantages. Alite understood that security would not come from money, influence, or fear would come from preparation, timing, and controlled action. Internal reflection became unavoidable. Guilt, awareness, and moral reckoning accompanied each decision. Every act performed under duress carried consequences not only for himself, but for others. Every choice made in the name of survival weighed on the conscience. Recognizing this weight was essential, because ignoring it would only perpetuate the cycle of danger and compromise. Strategic patience became the primary weapon. Impulse had once been necessary, but in this phase of life, discipline ruled. Opportunities had to be observed and assessed. Timing mattered more than speed. Acting too soon invited retaliation. Acting too late invited entrapment. The optimal moment required precise alignment of awareness, readiness, and environmental conditions. The criminal environment, however, remained unforgiving. Tests appeared in subtle forms, questions designed to gauge loyalty, requests framed as routine but intended to measure reaction, provocations meant to observe restraint. Every day demanded constant recalibration. Maintaining equilibrium while protecting intent became an art form. Emotional control was the difference between survival and exposure. The psychological impact was constant. Even mundane interactions carried potential consequence. Conversations had layers of meaning. Silence could be interpreted as resistance or indifference. Compliance had to be demonstrated carefully, never overextended. Every gesture, every word, and every glance had to be considered within a broader pattern of influence and perception. The internal struggle intensified. Desire for freedom, personal safety, and integrity competed with loyalty, obligation, and habit. The tension required constant self-discipline. Emotional detachment became necessary not as a defense against empathy, but as a strategy to preserve autonomy and ensure survival. Recognizing the difference between necessity and indulgence shaped each decision. Physical awareness matched mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned by years of stress. Reflexes were sharp. Sensory input was heightened. Even fatigue contributed to heightened awareness, reinforcing survival instincts rather than diminishing them. Strength alone could no longer protect intuition. Patience, observation were now decisive. Preparation for disengagement continued silently. Patterns of behavior were studied. Social dynamics were mapped. Predictable sequences became opportunities for measured action. Every detail, however minor, was considered. The placement of people, the timing of routines, and the likely responses to specific interventions. This intelligence allowed action without exposure, autonomy without confrontation. The criminal world, however, was relentless. Any deviation from perceived loyalty was tested. Small errors were magnified. Timing, and more timing dictated outcomes. Disengagement required not only observation but execution with precision. One miscalculation could compromise safety irreversibly. Reflection sharpened moral clarity. The illusions of power and respect within the criminal system were unmistakable. What appeared as honor or loyalty often masked coercion and self-interest. Authority was rarely principled. It was situational. Reputation was conditional. Obedience was enforced and independence was punished. Recognizing these truths enabled strategic movement beyond the system. This stage demanded endurance. Emotional resilience, mental discipline, and physical stamina were all required. Fear and awareness coexisted, shaping every decision. Patience became a skill more vital than courage. Observation more important than aggression. Strategic restraint more effective than confrontation. Survival depended not on domination but on careful calculation and timing. Decision-making reached a heightened intensity. Each choice carried the potential to preserve or destroy autonomy. Minor interactions could cascade into life-altering consequences. Patterns of observation guided action, creating opportunities to disengage safely. The ability to respond without revealing intent became essential. Clarity emerged gradually. Remaining fully engaged guaranteed erosion of identity and autonomy. Withdrawal, while risky, offered preservation, safety, and moral alignment. The path forward required careful planning, patience, and execution based on precise observation of human behavior and environmental conditions. Through it all, the lesson became clear: the true challenge in a dangerous system is not confrontation but awareness, not strength but timing, not loyalty but independence. The most valuable skill is understanding when to act, how to act, and when restraint preserves life and choice. As the night deepened, the insight crystallized: the journey toward autonomy is not sudden. It is deliberate. It is disciplined. It is strategic. Survival depends on awareness, patience, and moral clarity more than any external show of power. The threshold of transformation approaches, and with preparation the possibility of true independence draws closer. The city had a rhythm that only those attuned to danger could hear, a pulse beneath the ordinary that warned, guided, and demanded constant awareness. In these quiet hours, John Alite could feel the invisible pressures of a world built on fear, loyalty, and silent enforcement. Every sound, every movement, every shift in the patterns of life carried information that could mean survival or destruction. In such a place, nothing was trivial, and every decision was critical. The criminal structure he navigated had become increasingly volatile. Authority shifted quietly yet decisively. Those who had once seemed untouchable were now vulnerable to challenge, and alliances fractured as expectations and fear collided. Respect and loyalty existed, but they were conditional, momentary, and always subject to change. Understanding this was essential. No reputation, no demonstration of loyalty, no past service could guarantee safety. Survival depended entirely on observation, timing, and discipline. Visibility was simultaneously essential and dangerous. Being too present risked entanglement and scrutiny. Being absent invited suspicion. Every interaction had to appear natural, casual, unsuspicious, yet meaningful enough to maintain position. Every word, gesture, and expression was a calculated component of survival strategy. The smallest deviation could trigger questions, tests, or challenges designed to reveal true intentions. Maintaining equilibrium became a constant mental exercise. Observation became the central tool for survival. Subtle behaviors, repeated routines, and the unspoken patterns of interaction provided critical insight. Understanding not only what people did but why they did it allowed Alite to anticipate danger and protect autonomy. Knowledge became leverage, patience became power, and timing became the most valuable resource. Every movement had to align with these observations to maintain balance and minimize risk. The physical and psychological toll was unrelenting. Sleep was shallow, rest fractured, and the body remained primed for threat even when danger was absent. Emotional stress accumulated quietly, shaping perception and guiding instinctive reactions. Yet the strain also created clarity. Fear, when recognized and controlled, illuminated potential risks and highlighted opportunities. It was no longer a paralyzing force but a tool for precise decision-making. Financial success, while visible and impressive, no longer signified security. Money drew attention, invited envy, and increased exposure. Wealth did not protect from retaliation or betrayal. It amplified the stakes. The lessons were clear. True safety comes not from resources, influence, or intimidation, but from preparation, strategic action, and disciplined restraint. Autonomy and survival depended on intelligence and foresight, rather than material power. Internal reflection became increasingly unavoidable. The consequences of past actions weighed heavily, both morally and practically. Every compromise, every enforced act of loyalty, and every engagement carried long-term implications for self and others. Recognizing this weight was essential, because denial would only perpetuate risk and moral erosion. Awareness of these consequences provided guidance for strategic decisions moving forward. Strategic patience emerged as the most critical skill. Impulsive actions had once been necessary to survive immediate threats, but long-term survival demanded measured restraint. Opportunities had to be observed, evaluated, and acted upon only when conditions aligned optimally. Acting too soon could provoke retaliation. Acting too late could allow exposure. Patience, timing, and foresight became the central elements of effective navigation. The criminal environment remained unforgiving. Tests were continuous, subtle, and relentless. Questions, provocations, and minor requests were all designed to measure loyalty, gauge reactions, and maintain control over individuals. Observing these dynamics and responding appropriately required constant vigilance, emotional control, and adaptability. Every reaction needed calibration, visible, neutral, measured, and never betraying true intent. Mental discipline was paramount. Every thought, action, and interaction had to be considered within a broader strategic framework. Decisions were never isolated, they carried cascading consequences. The ability to anticipate reactions, understand hidden motives, and navigate interpersonal dynamics determined both safety and the potential for disengagement from a destructive system. Emotional mastery, more than any form of aggression or intimidation, defined survival. The internal struggle intensified. Desire for autonomy, safety, and moral clarity competed with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment became a strategic necessity. not a sign of coldness but a means to preserve life and independence. Recognizing the difference between necessity and indulgence shaped decisions and reinforced disciplined restraint. Each choice was a balance between risk and opportunity, short-term safety and long-term freedom. Physical awareness mirrored mental acuity. The body remained alert, responsive, and conditioned to detect threats. Reflexes were sharpened, perception heightened. Fatigue, rather than diminishing capacity, reinforced vigilance, allowing the mind to remain adaptive and responsive. Strength alone could not guarantee survival. Perception, discipline, and timing were decisive. Preparation for strategic disengagement continued quietly. Patterns were analyzed, opportunities assessed, and behaviors of others studied meticulously. Timing and positioning became central. Every routine, every habit, every interaction was considered within a mental map of risk and opportunity. This map allowed for decisive action with minimal exposure, preserving autonomy while reducing potential retaliation. Despite preparation, the environment was relentless. Small deviations, perceived hesitation, or even inadvertent expressions could invite scrutiny. The balance between engagement and detachment required constant calibration. Emotional composure was essential. Acting visibly too soon or delaying action too long could have fatal consequences. Every decision was evaluated not only for immediate impact but for potential chain reactions. Reflection continued to sharpen clarity. The illusions of power, respect, and loyalty became undeniable. Authority was situational, often self-serving and enforced through fear rather than principle. Loyalty was temporary, contingent upon immediate benefit, and obedience was demanded under threat. Recognizing these truths highlighted the necessity of strategic withdrawal. Freedom and safety could only be preserved through deliberate, disciplined planning and precise execution. This stage demanded endurance, mental focus, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to form the foundation for survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became a tool, observation a weapon, and strategic restraint the defining skill. True courage emerged not in confrontation, but in the ability to wait, observe, and act decisively under the right conditions. Decision-making reached a critical intensity. Each choice had the potential to preserve or destroy autonomy. Minor interactions, seemingly inconsequential, could cascade into life-altering outcomes. Careful assessment of patterns and behavior allowed for opportunities to create a safe path toward independence. Execution required precision, discipline, and restraint. Clarity solidified. Continued full engagement guaranteed erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral integrity. Disengagement, while risky, offered the possibility of survival, safety, and ethical alignment. Preparation, observation, and timing were central to ensuring the successful transition out of a destructive system. Awareness, patience, and disciplined action would determine the outcome. The lessons of this period were unmistakable. Survival is not determined by aggression or intimidation but by awareness, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength is measured not by dominance over others but by the ability to control fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy in the face of constant pressure. The threshold of transformation approaches, and the possibility of true independence is within reach for those who have cultivated the discipline to seize it. The streets were silent but not forgiving. In the stillness of night, every shadow seemed alive with possibility and threat alike. For John Alite, those quiet hours were more revealing than any confrontation in daylight could be. The criminal world had taught him that danger was rarely obvious. It lurked in subtle shifts of behavior, in seemingly mundane decisions, in opportunities that appeared harmless at first glance. Awareness had become a matter of life and death, and the slightest lapse could unravel years of careful survival. The criminal structure around him was as unpredictable as it was unforgiving. Power moved silently from one hand to another, and loyalty existed only as long as it served someone's interest. Those who had once commanded respect now navigated suspicion, and positions of influence were always contingent on performance and obedience. Any misstep could trigger consequences that extended far beyond the individual, affecting alliances, resources, and even personal safety. In such an environment, survival required constant calculation. Visibility remained a double-edged sword. Too much engagement drew scrutiny and responsibility, while reduced presence invited speculation and suspicion. Every interaction had to be intentional yet appear natural, carefully calibrated to avoid unnecessary attention. Timing became crucial. Every gesture, every word, every glance was measured to ensure that intent was hidden while control remained intact. The balance between presence and discretion was fragile, and maintaining it required relentless focus. Observation became the most powerful tool. Subtle gestures, repeated routines, patterns of speech, and body language all offered insights into hidden intentions. Understanding not just what people did, but why they did it, allowed Alite to anticipate potential threats and navigate danger without creating conflict. Knowledge became leverage, patience became power, and timing became the defining skill of survival. Each insight brought him closer to autonomy, but it also reinforced the need for caution and restraint. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was interrupted, often shallow, and moments of rest offered only temporary relief. The mind remained alert, constantly processing potential threats, recalibrating decisions, and evaluating risk. Emotional strain accumulated silently, shaping perception and guiding instinctive responses. Yet in this pressure, clarity emerged. Fear could be managed and harnessed, becoming a tool for precise, deliberate action rather than a source of paralysis. Material wealth no longer represented safety or influence. Money drew attention, attracted envy, and increased exposure. It could create temporary comfort, but did nothing to protect against betrayal or miscalculation. The understanding that resources were not a safeguard, but a potential liability crystallized over time. True security, he realized, would not come from influence, intimidation, or wealth. It would come from awareness, patience, preparation, and the disciplined use of opportunity. Reflection deepened. Every past decision, every compromise, every act of obedience carried consequences, not just for Alite, but for those around him. Moral awareness could not be ignored. It served as a guide in choosing actions carefully, balancing survival with integrity. Understanding the weight of previous choices shaped the approach to each new situation. The realization that continued participation in the system guaranteed moral and personal erosion became unavoidable. Strategic patience became indispensable. Impulsivity could no longer be tolerated. Opportunities for safety or autonomy had to be observed, assessed, and acted upon only when conditions aligned favorably. Acting too soon risked retaliation, waiting too long risked exposure. Timing became more valuable than strength or influence. Each decision had to be made with precision, weighing immediate risk against long-term consequence. Tests within the criminal structure were constant and subtle. Questions posed innocuously, requests framed as routine, and minor provocations were all methods to gauge loyalty and reaction. Responding appropriately required careful calibration, neutrality without disengagement, compliance without overcommitment. Emotional control became more important than physical readiness, and discernment outweighed aggression in determining safety. Mental discipline was paramount. Every thought, every reaction, every word was considered within a strategic framework. Decisions were interconnected, carrying potential consequences that extended far beyond immediate outcomes. Anticipating reactions, reading motives, and adjusting behavior accordingly defined both survival and the ability to eventually disengage. Emotional mastery, not dominance, became the most important skill. Internal tension was constant. Desire for autonomy, safety, and moral alignment competed with fear, loyalty, and habit. Emotional detachment became a necessity, not a lack of empathy, but a strategy to preserve life and independence. The distinction between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns shaped every decision, and awareness of this distinction protected integrity and increased control over outcomes. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned by years of heightened vigilance, reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool rather than a liability, reinforcing focus and responsiveness. Survival was no longer a matter of brute force. It required perception, timing, and disciplined action. Every physical sense contributed to informed decision-making. Preparation for disengagement intensified. Behavioral patterns were analyzed, social dynamics mapped, and predictable sequences identified as opportunities for safe movement. Each detail, from the placement of individuals to the timing of routines, was part of a larger strategy. Strategic positioning allowed him to act decisively without exposure, preserving autonomy while minimizing risk. The criminal environment remained vigilant. Tests, both subtle and overt, were frequent. Even small deviations or signs of hesitation were observed and interpreted as potential threats. Balancing participation with detachment required continuous recalibration. Emotional composure and neutrality were essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could have catastrophic consequences. Each interaction required evaluation of immediate and long-term implications. Moral clarity became sharper. Power, respect, and loyalty within the criminal system were revealed as illusory. Authority was situational and self-serving. Loyalty was temporary and conditional. Obedience was enforced under threat, not principle. Recognizing these truths underscored the necessity of strategic withdrawal. Independence, safety, and survival required deliberate, disciplined planning and precise execution. Endurance was the defining skill. Emotional resilience, mental discipline, and physical readiness combined to support survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding each decision. Patience was a tool, observation a weapon, and strategic restraint the defining feature of survival. Courage manifested not in confrontation but in the ability to maintain composure, observe carefully, and act decisively when opportunity presented itself. Decision-making reached heightened intensity. Every choice carried the potential to preserve or destroy autonomy. Small, seemingly trivial interactions could produce cascading consequences. Careful observation and strategic timing created opportunities for movement towards safety and independence. Execution required precision, restraint, and awareness of potential chain reactions. Clarity solidified. Continued engagement guaranteed erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral integrity. Disengagement, though risky, offered survival, safety, and ethical alignment. Preparation, observation, and precise timing were essential. Awareness, patience, and disciplined action determined whether independence could be achieved and maintained. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is determined not by aggression or dominance but by awareness, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength is measured not by the control of others, but by the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under constant pressure. The threshold of transformation approached, and the possibility of freedom and true independence grew near with every disciplined step. The streets were quieter than usual, but quietness did not bring comfort. In fact, it carried its own tension, a subtle reminder that danger was rarely loud. For John Alite, nights like this were both a test and a tool. Silence allowed him to observe, to measure, and to anticipate. Every flicker of movement, every faint sound, every moment of human behavior became data to navigate a world built on fear, deception, and shifting power. Survival depended on understanding the invisible patterns that governed each interaction. The criminal world operated on systems of control that were invisible to outsiders, but unmistakably clear to those embedded within it. Authority was rarely granted, it was enforced through fear, obligation, and constant testing. Loyalty existed, but it was conditional and transactional. Any deviation, perceived or real, could trigger consequences, both immediate and delayed. The rules were simple to understand but impossible to predict. A single misstep could jeopardize years of careful survival. Visibility remained both an advantage and a threat. Being present too often invited scrutiny, while absence risked suspicion. Every action had to appear natural, even when it was calculated. Every word, every gesture, every glance had to convey neutrality while preserving control. Timing was critical. Moving too quickly could provoke retaliation, while hesitation could signal weakness. The balance between engagement and discretion was a constant, high-stakes negotiation. Observation had become the most important skill. Small gestures, repeated routines, and subtle behavioral patterns provided insight into intentions and vulnerabilities. Understanding not only what people did but why they did it allowed Alite to anticipate danger and avoid unnecessary exposure. Knowledge became leverage, patience became a weapon, and timing became more valuable than influence or force. Each insight added clarity to his strategy, guiding him towards safety and eventual independence. The mental toll was unrelenting. Sleep was often shallow, interrupted, or fleeting. The mind remained alert, constantly analyzing threats, recalibrating actions, and evaluating interactions. Emotional stress accumulated quietly, shaping perception and guiding instinct. Yet in this constant vigilance, clarity emerged. Fear, when recognized and controlled, became a tool rather than a hindrance. It highlighted risk, informed decisions, and reinforced discipline. Financial security offered no protection. Wealth brought visibility, envy, and increased exposure. It could create temporary comfort, but it did not protect from betrayal, manipulation, or miscalculation. Alite understood that true safety was not achieved through money or influence, but through awareness, timing, preparation, and disciplined action. Autonomy and survival depended on strategy, not material accumulation. Reflection became unavoidable. Past choices, compromises, and enforced acts of loyalty carried consequences that extended beyond himself. Moral awareness could not be ignored, for it served as a guide in navigating the complexity of each new situation. Understanding the implications of prior actions shaped the approach to every decision. Continued participation in a destructive system guaranteed further erosion of integrity, identity, and autonomy. Strategic patience became indispensable. Impulsive action had once been necessary to respond to immediate threats, but long-term survival demanded careful observation and deliberate restraint. Opportunities for autonomy and safety had to be observed, assessed, and acted upon only when conditions aligned. Acting too early risked exposure and retaliation. Waiting too long risked missed opportunity. Patience and timing were more valuable than aggression or dominance. The environment remained unforgiving. Subtle tests appeared constantly. Questions framed innocuously. Requests presented as routine. Minor provocations designed to measure loyalty. Responding appropriately required careful calibration. Neutrality without disengagement. Compliance without overcommitment. Observation without detection. These became the skills that determined both safety and the potential for eventual withdrawal. Emotional control became the central tool of survival. Mental discipline was paramount. Every thought, reaction, and decision had to be considered within a strategic framework. Choices were rarely isolated. Each carried consequences that extended outward, affecting relationships, reputation, and security. The ability to anticipate responses, read motives, and adjust behavior accordingly defined both survival and the path toward independence. Emotional mastery, rather than physical dominance, became the critical skill. Internal tension persisted. Desire for autonomy, safety, and moral clarity competed with habit, fear, and obligation. Emotional detachment became a strategic necessity, not a sign of coldness, but a mechanism for preserving life and autonomy. Recognizing the difference between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns allowed Alite to maintain control over decisions, avoid compromise, and protect integrity. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool rather than a liability. Survival no longer depended solely on strength or intimidation. Observation, timing, and disciplined action were the deciding factors. Every sensory input was integrated into a mental framework designed to anticipate, prepare, and respond. Preparation for disengagement intensified. Behavioral patterns were mapped, social dynamics analyzed, and predictable sequences identified as opportunities for safe movement. Every detail from physical positioning to the timing of routines was accounted for. Strategic positioning allowed action without exposure, preserving autonomy and minimizing risk. The environment remained vigilant. Minor errors, hesitations, or perceived deviations were scrutinized. Balancing engagement and detachment demanded continuous recalibration. Emotional composure and neutrality were essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could produce consequences that were both immediate and cascading. Every choice was evaluated not only for short-term impact but for long-term implications. Clarity of moral understanding deepened. Power, respect, and loyalty in this system were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty was temporary, and obedience was enforced under threat rather than principle. Recognizing these truths highlighted the necessity of careful, strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and moral alignment could only be achieved through disciplined preparation and precise action. Endurance became the defining trait. Emotional resilience, mental discipline, and physical readiness combined to form the foundation for survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became the tool, observation the weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of true courage. Acting decisively when the right opportunity presented itself became the key to transitioning from survival to autonomy. Decision-making reached new intensity. Each action could preserve or destroy autonomy. Small, seemingly insignificant interactions could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Careful assessment of patterns and precise timing created opportunities to move safely toward independence. Execution required discipline, awareness, and foresight to ensure minimal exposure and maximum preservation of self. The final realization was unmistakable. Continued full engagement guaranteed further erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral integrity. Disengagement, while risky, offered survival, safety, and the preservation of ethical values. Preparation, patience, observation, and disciplined timing became the essential tools for creating a pathway to independence. Awareness, resilience, and controlled action determined the likelihood of successful transformation. The lesson was clear: survival is not dictated by aggression, intimidation, or dominance. It is determined by awareness, discipline, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength lies not in controlling others, but in navigating fear, acting decisively, and preserving autonomy in the face of constant pressure. The threshold of change approaches, and the possibility of true independence is now within reach for those who have cultivated the patience, awareness, and discipline to seize it. The night air had a weight to it, heavy with the unspoken tension of a city that never truly slept. For John Alite, the darkness was a tool as much as it was a threat. In the quiet moments between lives, chaos, he could observe without being observed, consider without pressure, and plan without haste. The criminal world he had inhabited demanded constant vigilance, yet in its silence, patterns revealed themselves. Every step, every gesture, every choice carried information, and learning to read it meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. The environment around him had grown more unpredictable. Power shifted quietly, often invisibly, from one hand to another. Loyalty, once assumed, now existed only as a fragile arrangement dependent on circumstance. Respect could vanish overnight, replaced by suspicion or outright hostility. Those who seemed untouchable were vulnerable, and positions of authority were contingent upon constant compliance. Understanding these dynamics was essential. One miscalculation could unravel years of careful navigation, leaving the unprepared exposed to consequences they could not anticipate. Visibility remained both a necessity and a threat. Being too present invited scrutiny and responsibility, while withdrawing entirely aroused suspicion. Each interaction had to appear casual, neutral, and unremarkable, yet subtly maintain influence and control. Timing was paramount. Too quick an action risked retaliation, too slow and opportunities slipped away. The delicate balance between engagement and discretion required relentless attention, a focus that had become instinctive yet exhausting. Observation had become Alite's most vital skill. Every small movement, repeated routine, and subtle expression offered insight into intentions and vulnerabilities. Anticipating how others would act under pressure allowed him to navigate danger without exposure. Knowledge became leverage. Patience became a weapon. Timing became more powerful than influence, dominance, or wealth. Each insight brought clarity to his strategy, offering pathways to autonomy while minimizing risk. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was fragmented, often shallow, and rest offered only temporary relief. The mind remained constantly alert, processing threats, recalibrating plans, and evaluating potential outcomes. Emotional strain accumulated, shaping perception and guiding instinctive reactions. Yet within this constant tension, clarity emerged. Fear, when acknowledged and controlled, was no longer paralyzing. It became a guide, highlighting risk and illuminating opportunity. Financial security provided no true protection. Wealth attracted attention, envy, and scrutiny. It could create comfort but did nothing to guard against betrayal or miscalculation. Alite understood that true security came from preparation, observation, and disciplined execution, not from resources, intimidation, or influence. Autonomy and survival were tied directly to strategic thought and careful timing rather than material power. Reflection deepened. Every past decision, compromise, and act of loyalty carried consequences extending beyond himself. Moral awareness could not be ignored. It acted as a compass for navigating a world built on fear and coercion. Recognizing the long-term implications of past actions helped shape the strategy for the present. Continued engagement in the system guaranteed erosion of identity, integrity, and autonomy, while calculated, Patient disengagement offered the possibility of preservation and survival. Patience had become indispensable. Impulsivity, once a tool for responding to immediate threats, was now a liability. Opportunities for safety or autonomy had to be observed, assessed, and acted upon only when conditions aligned optimally. Acting prematurely risked exposure and retaliation. Delaying too long risked missed opportunity. Timing and observation were now more valuable than aggression or dominance. Subtle tests were constant. Questions, requests, or provocations gauged loyalty and intention. Responding appropriately demanded careful calibration. Neutrality without disengagement, compliance without overcommitment, and careful observation without detection were necessary skills. Emotional control became the central tool for navigating complex dynamics, and awareness determined survival, and the potential to safely withdraw. Mental discipline was essential. Every thought, action, and decision carried cascading consequences. Anticipating reactions, understanding motives, and adjusting behavior accordingly defined both survival and the eventual path to independence. Emotional mastery, rather than physical aggression, determined safety. The ability to remain calm, patient, and strategic under constant pressure became the most critical skill of all. Internal tension persisted. The desire for autonomy, safety, and moral alignment competed with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment was strategic, not cold. It preserved life and independence. Recognizing the difference between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns allowed Alite to maintain control over his decisions and protect his integrity. Each choice became a calculated measure of risk versus reward. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened. Perception heightened. Fatigue became a tool rather than a liability, enhancing focus and responsiveness. Survival no longer depended solely on strength or intimidation. Observation, timing, and disciplined action were decisive. Every sense contributed to informed, deliberate decision-making. Preparation for disengagement intensified. Behavioral patterns were mapped, social dynamics analyzed, and predictable sequences identified as opportunities for safe movement. Every detail, from the placement of people to the timing of routines, was accounted for. Strategic positioning allowed action without exposure, preserving autonomy and minimizing risk. Knowledge combined with patience created actionable pathways. The environment remained vigilant. Minor errors, hesitations, or perceived deviations were scrutinized. Balancing engagement with detachment required constant recalibration. Emotional composure was essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could have cascading consequences. Each choice was evaluated for both immediate and long-term impact, ensuring that movement toward independence remained viable. Clarity of moral and practical understanding deepened. Power, respect, and loyalty in the criminal system were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty conditional, obedience enforced under threat. Recognizing these truths underscored the necessity of strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and moral alignment could only be achieved through patient preparation, precise observation, and disciplined action. Endurance became the defining quality. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to support survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became a tool, observation a weapon, and strategic restraint the defining measure of courage. Acting decisively when conditions allowed became the key to transforming survival into autonomy. Decision-making reached heightened intensity. Every interaction carried potential consequences. Minor actions could trigger a chain reaction affecting autonomy and safety. Careful observation and strategic timing created opportunities to move toward independence with minimal exposure. Execution required precision, restraint, and foresight. Clarity emerged fully. Continued engagement guaranteed erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral integrity. Disengagement, while risky, offered survival, safety, and ethical alignment. Preparation, observation, patience, and disciplined timing became the essential tools for creating a pathway to independence. Awareness, resilience, and controlled action determined the likelihood of successful transformation. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is not determined by aggression, intimidation, or dominance. It is determined by awareness, discipline, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength lies in navigating fear, acting decisively, and preserving autonomy under constant pressure. The threshold of change approaches, and the possibility of true independence is within reach for those who have cultivated the patience, awareness, and discipline to seize it. The city's skyline shimmered faintly under the weight of the night, but the streets below were anything but calm. Shadows stretched across empty sidewalks, hiding the subtle movements of lives intertwined in silence, loyalty, and fear. For John Alite, these nights were both a mirror and a magnifying glass. In them, the patterns of behavior became clearer, the calculations of risk more precise, and the stakes of survival unmistakably real. The world he navigated demanded constant awareness, and the smallest error could undo years of careful effort. Life within the criminal network had grown more intricate with every passing day. Authority shifted in ways that were almost invisible. Loyalty existed only as long as it served immediate interests, and respect could vanish in an instant. One moment someone could appear untouchable. The next, they could be undermined by subtle alliances and calculated manipulation. For those inside, survival depended on more than boldness or aggression. It required strategy, patience, and the ability to anticipate reactions before they happened. Visibility remained a complex challenge. Too much engagement drew scrutiny and responsibility. Too little aroused suspicion and doubt. Every gesture, conversation, and interaction had to convey neutrality while maintaining control. Timing became more important than ever. Acting too quickly risked provoking retaliation. Waiting too long could allow opportunities to slip away. Each choice was measured and deliberate, executed with precision to preserve both safety and autonomy. Observation was the tool that made all of this possible. Every small movement, every repetitive action, and every nuance of behavior offered insight into intentions and vulnerabilities. Understanding not just what people did, but why, allowed Alite to predict potential outcomes and avoid unnecessary risk. Knowledge became leverage. Patience became a weapon. Timing became the most valuable resource. Each insight brought him closer to independence while simultaneously minimizing exposure. The mental and emotional toll was relentless. Sleep was often brief and shallow, the mind remaining alert even during moments of rest. Emotional strain accumulated quietly, shaping perception and guiding instinctive responses. Fear became a guiding force rather than a paralyzing one. It highlighted risk and allowed for measured, disciplined responses rather than reckless action. Awareness became the currency of survival, and the cost of inattention could be devastating. Financial security was no longer a marker of safety. Wealth drew attention, envy, and increased scrutiny. While it could create temporary comfort, it offered no protection from betrayal, misjudgment, or internal conflict. Alite understood that true safety was not bought, it was earned through observation, patience, preparation, and calculated action. Autonomy and survival were dependent on strategy, foresight, and self-control. Rather than money or intimidation, reflection became unavoidable. Every past decision, every act of loyalty, every compromise carried consequences that extended beyond the immediate moment. Moral awareness was no longer optional, it became a guide for navigating each new situation. Understanding the impact of prior choices allowed for informed, strategic decisions in the present. Continued immersion in the criminal system guaranteed erosion of integrity, identity, and autonomy, while careful disengagement offered a chance at preservation and survival. Strategic patience became indispensable. Impulsivity, once a necessary tool for immediate survival, was now a liability. Opportunities had to be observed and assessed, with action taken only when conditions aligned favorably. Acting too soon risked exposure or retaliation. Delaying too long risked lost opportunity. Patience and timing became more valuable than aggression or domination. Each decision required careful consideration, with the understanding that the smallest miscalculation could carry life-altering consequences. The environment was unrelenting. Subtle tests of loyalty, intentional provocations, and seemingly routine questions were all part of a constant evaluation of character and reliability. Responding appropriately required careful calibration, neutrality without detachment, compliance without overcommitment, observation without exposure. Emotional control became more crucial than physical strength. Awareness of intent and consequence defined both immediate survival and the ability to eventually withdraw safely from danger. Mental discipline was critical. Every thought, every reaction, every word carried potential consequences. Anticipating behavior, understanding motives, and adjusting actions accordingly determined both survival and the potential to achieve autonomy. Emotional mastery, rather than aggression, became the foundation of effective strategy. Remaining calm, patient, and calculated under constant pressure was essential to protect life, identity, and freedom. Internal tension persisted. The desire for autonomy, safety, and moral alignment constantly clashed with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment became necessary not as a lack of empathy, but as a tool to preserve life and independence. Distinguishing between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns was critical, allowing Alite to maintain control and protect integrity. Every decision was weighed carefully, balancing risk, consequence, and opportunity. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool to maintain heightened awareness. Survival no longer relied on force or intimidation alone. Observation, timing, and disciplined action determined outcomes. Each sense was utilized to create a comprehensive understanding of potential danger and opportunity, ensuring decisions were informed and deliberate. Preparation for disengagement continued quietly. Social dynamics were analyzed, behavioral patterns mapped, and predictable sequences identified as opportunities for safe action. Every detail, from physical positioning to timing, was considered within a broader strategy designed to minimize exposure and preserve autonomy. Strategic planning allowed movement without detection, transforming observation and patience into actionable steps toward freedom. Even with preparation, the environment was unforgiving. Minor errors, hesitation, or perceived deviations were noticed and interpreted as potential threats. Balancing engagement and detachment required constant recalibration. Emotional composure was critical. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could have cascading consequences. Each interaction was analyzed for immediate and long-term implications to maintain safety and control. Clarity deepened regarding power, loyalty, and authority. In the criminal system, these concepts were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty was temporary, and obedience was enforced under threat. Recognizing these truths underscored the need for strategic withdrawal. Freedom, security, and moral alignment were achievable only through preparation, discipline, and precise action. Endurance was paramount. Emotional resilience, mental discipline, and physical readiness combined to ensure survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became a tool, observation a weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of courage. Acting decisively when opportunity arose became the key to transforming survival into autonomy. Decision-making reached a critical intensity. Every interaction carried the potential to affect autonomy and safety. Seemingly minor actions could produce cascading consequences. Careful observation and precise timing created pathways toward independence. Execution required precision, restraint, and awareness of potential chain reactions. Every choice became an investment in freedom, calculated to minimize risk while maximizing opportunity. Clarity was undeniable. Continued immersion in the criminal system guaranteed further erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral integrity. Strategic disengagement, while risky, offered the potential for survival, safety, and ethical preservation. Preparation, observation, patience, and disciplined action were essential tools for creating a pathway to independence. Awareness, resilience, and controlled execution determined the likelihood of successful transformation. The lesson became unmistakable. Survival is not dictated by dominance or aggression, but by awareness, discipline, patience, and foresight. True strength is measured by the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under constant pressure. The threshold of change approaches, and the possibility of independence draws near with each careful, calculated step. The night stretched endlessly, heavy with the weight of a city that never truly rested. Its streets were alive with silent tension, the hum of life weaving between shadows, alleyways, and the quiet hum of distant engines. For John Alite, these hours were a crucible of awareness, reflection, and strategy. In the darkness, patterns became clear, opportunities became visible, and danger revealed itself in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. The life he had led demanded not just courage, but constant vigilance and deliberate calculation. The environment he navigated had grown increasingly intricate. Power shifted silently, alliances were conditional, and respect had vanished without warning. Authority was often only a matter of perception, maintained by fear, manipulation, and constant testing. One misstep, a slight misjudgment, could unravel years of careful planning. Survival required far more than force. It demanded discipline, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior that could anticipate moves before they occurred. Visibility remained a critical challenge. Being too present drew attention, responsibility, and risk. Withdrawing entirely invited doubt and suspicion. Every gesture, word, and action had to communicate neutrality while maintaining control. Timing was everything. Acting too quickly could provoke retaliation. Acting too slowly could result in missed opportunities. The balance between engagement and discretion was delicate, requiring constant attention and self-control. Observation had become a primary weapon. Every subtle gesture, repeated pattern, and nuanced behavior offered insight into intentions, vulnerabilities, and potential threats. Understanding the motivations behind actions allowed Alite to anticipate outcomes and navigate danger without unnecessary exposure. Knowledge became leverage, patience became power, and timing became more valuable than influence or intimidation. Every new insight expanded the map of opportunity, creating pathways toward autonomy and safety. The psychological demands were relentless. Sleep was fragmented, often shallow, with rest offering only temporary respite. The mind remained alert, constantly processing threats, evaluating risk, and recalibrating strategies. Emotional strain accumulated quietly, shaping instinctive responses and coloring judgment. Yet in this pressure, clarity emerged. Fear, once paralyzing, transformed into a tool for precise, deliberate action, guiding decisions and highlighting both danger and opportunity. Financial security proved no safeguard. Money brought attention, envy, and exposure. While it could provide comfort, it offered no protection from betrayal, misjudgment, or coercion. Alite understood that true safety and autonomy were not bought, they were earned through preparation, awareness, and disciplined execution. Survival depended on strategic thinking and timing, not wealth, dominance, or intimidation. Reflection deepened as each day passed. Every act of loyalty, every compromise, and every decision carried consequences extending beyond the immediate moment. Moral awareness could not be ignored, serving as a compass for navigating a world dominated by fear and self-interest. Recognizing the implications of past actions informed present strategy, highlighting the need for careful disengagement. Continued immersion guaranteed erosion of integrity, identity, and autonomy, while calculated withdrawal offered the possibility of preservation and freedom. Strategic patience became indispensable. Impulsivity, once necessary for immediate survival, became a liability. Opportunities had to be observed, assessed, and acted upon only when conditions aligned favorably. Premature action risked exposure and retaliation, while hesitation risked lost opportunity. Patience and timing had become more valuable than aggression or force. Every decision required careful consideration, with an understanding of its short and long-term consequences. Environment tested him constantly. Subtle provocations, routine questions, and small challenges were methods to gauge loyalty and reaction. Responding appropriately required careful calibration, neutrality without detachment, compliance without overcommitment, observation without exposure. Emotional control became paramount, guiding safe navigation and preserving both survival and autonomy. Awareness and discernment became essential tools in a system where testing was constant. Mental discipline was crucial. Every thought, action, and word carried cascading consequences. Anticipating reactions, understanding motives, and adjusting behavior accordingly defined survival and the potential path toward independence. Emotional mastery, not physical dominance, became the foundation of safety. Remaining calm, calculated, and patient under relentless pressure allowed Alite to navigate the environment strategically and protect his autonomy. Internal tension persisted. The desire for autonomy, safety, and moral clarity was constantly in conflict with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment was a necessity, not a lack of empathy, but a tool for preserving life and independence. Recognizing the distinction between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns allowed Alite to maintain control, protect integrity, and make decisions that reinforced autonomy and survival. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, trained to detect even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool rather than a liability, reinforcing focus and responsiveness. Survival no longer relied solely on strength or intimidation. Observation, timing, and disciplined action became the primary determinants of safety. Every sensory input contributed to informed, deliberate decision-making. Preparation for strategic disengagement became increasingly meticulous. Social dynamics were studied, behavioral patterns analyzed, and sequences of routine identified as opportunities for safe movement. Every detail from timing to positioning was integrated into a larger strategy designed to minimize exposure and preserve autonomy. Knowledge, combined with patience, created actionable pathways that could be executed without unnecessary risk. Even with careful preparation, the environment remained unforgiving. Minor errors, hesitation, or perceived deviations were scrutinized. Balancing engagement and detachment demanded constant adjustment. Emotional composure and neutrality were essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at critical moments could produce cascading consequences. Each interaction was assessed for immediate and long-term impact, ensuring movement toward independence was safe and deliberate. Clarity about power, loyalty, and authority deepened. These concepts were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty temporary, and obedience enforced under threat rather than principle. Recognizing these realities underscored the need for strategic withdrawal. Freedom, security, and moral alignment could only be achieved through disciplined preparation, precise observation, and calculated execution. Endurance became central. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to sustain survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became the primary tool, observation the weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of true courage. Acting decisively when opportunities arose became the key to turning survival into autonomy. Decision-making reached its most critical phase. Every interaction carried potential consequences. Seemingly minor actions could trigger outcomes that affected autonomy, safety, and long-term stability. Careful observation, assessment, and timing created a path toward independence. Execution required precision, awareness, and restraint to minimize risk and maximize control. Clarity emerged fully, continued engagement, guaranteed erosion of identity, autonomy, and ethical integrity. Strategic disengagement, though risky, offered the possibility of survival, safety, and moral alignment. Preparation, observation, patience, and disciplined action were essential tools for creating a safe path to independence. Awareness, resilience, and control determined the likelihood of successful transformation. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is not dictated by force, intimidation, or aggression. It is determined by awareness, discipline, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength is measured by the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under relentless pressure. The threshold of change approaches, and independence is within reach for those who have cultivated patience, observation, and disciplined action. The city never truly slept, but the hours before dawn carried a quiet that was both dangerous and revealing. For John Alite, the pre-dawn hours were a time for observation, reflection, and planning. The streets were filled with hidden currents, movements, gestures, and interactions that could easily go unnoticed, but held crucial information for survival. Every moment demanded vigilance, every action required deliberation, and every decision carried weight. The criminal environment he had once navigated with fear and instinct now required strategy, discipline, and foresight. Power within this hidden world was fluid and often invisible. Authority existed only as long as it could be enforced, and loyalty was transactional, contingent upon immediate benefit. Respect was fragile, vulnerable to suspicion and envy, and those who seemed untouchable could quickly find themselves undermined by subtle manipulation. Survival depended not on force or intimidation alone, but on the ability to anticipate behavior, navigate social dynamics, and act decisively when opportunity presented itself. Visibility was a double-edged sword. Being too present drew attention, invited scrutiny, and increased exposure. Being too absent aroused suspicion and potentially hostility. Each gesture, word, and interaction had to convey neutrality while maintaining influence and control. Timing was essential. Acting too quickly risked provocation. Acting too slowly risked missed opportunity. Maintaining the balance between engagement and discretion required constant awareness and self-regulation. Observation had become a powerful tool. Every small movement, habitual action, and subtle expression offered insight into intentions, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Understanding not only what people did, but why, allowed Alite to anticipate risks and respond without unnecessary exposure. Knowledge became leverage, patience became a weapon, and timing became more valuable than influence, dominance, or material wealth. Each new insight offered a clearer path toward autonomy and safety. The psychological burden was constant. Sleep was often shallow, fragmented, and insufficient. Yet the mind remained hyper-aware, continuously processing potential threats, evaluating options, and recalibrating strategies. Emotional strain accumulated silently, shaping instinctive responses and refining judgment. Fear, once overwhelming, had become a tool. It highlighted danger, informed decisions, and reinforced the need for disciplined action. Awareness became the currency of survival, and inattention could carry catastrophic consequences. Financial security provided little protection. Money attracted attention, envy, and increased exposure. While it could offer comfort, it did not shield from betrayal, misjudgment, or coercion. Alite understood that true safety came from preparation, observation, and calculated execution rather than wealth, intimidation, or dominance. Autonomy and survival relied on strategy, foresight, and self-control rather than material power. Reflection became unavoidable. Each decision, act of loyalty, and compromise carried consequences extending beyond the immediate moment. Moral awareness was a critical guide in navigating the complex world of fear, influence, and manipulation. Understanding the long-term impact of past actions informed present strategy and emphasized the need for careful disengagement. Continued immersion guaranteed erosion of identity, autonomy, and moral clarity, while measured withdrawal offered a chance at preservation and freedom. Strategic patience was essential. Impulsivity, once necessary for immediate survival, now became a liability. Opportunities for safety or independence had to be observed, assessed, and acted upon only when conditions aligned optimally. Acting prematurely risked exposure and retaliation. Waiting too long risked missed opportunity. Timing and patience became more valuable than aggression or dominance. Every choice required careful deliberation, weighing short-term consequences against long-term outcomes. Tests were constant, subtle, and unrelenting. Routine questions, minor requests, and provocations were all designed to gauge loyalty and reaction. Responding appropriately required careful calibration. Neutral without disengaging, compliant without overcommitting, observant without being obvious. Emotional control became critical, guiding safe navigation and preserving both autonomy and survival. Awareness and discernment became indispensable tools for moving within a system designed to enforce obedience and test resilience. Mental discipline was paramount. Every thought, reaction, and word carried potential consequences. Anticipating behavior, understanding motives, and adjusting responses accordingly defined both survival and the ability to pursue autonomy. Emotional mastery, more than physical force, became the key to navigating a world built on fear and manipulation. Remaining calm, measured, and patient under constant scrutiny was essential to maintaining control and preserving independence. Internal tension persisted. The desire for autonomy, safety, and moral clarity competed with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment became a strategic necessity, not a lack of empathy, but a tool to preserve life and independence. Recognizing the difference between necessary compliance and indulgence in familiar patterns allowed Alite to maintain control over his decisions, protect integrity, and navigate the world with discipline. Every choice became a calculated measure of risk and opportunity. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool rather than a liability, reinforcing focus and responsiveness. Survival no longer depended on intimidation or force. Observation, timing, and strategic action determined outcomes. Each sensory input was incorporated into a comprehensive understanding of risk, ensuring decisions were informed, deliberate, and safe. Preparation for disengagement intensified. Social dynamics were analyzed, routines mapped, and predictable sequences identified as opportunities for safe action. Every detail from timing to positioning was considered in a broader strategy designed to minimize exposure and maximize autonomy. Knowledge, combined with patience, became actionable, providing pathways that could be executed with minimal risk. Even with preparation, the environment remained unforgiving. Minor errors, hesitation, or perceived deviations could attract scrutiny or provoke consequences. Balancing engagement with detachment required continuous adjustment. Emotional composure and neutrality were essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at critical moments could produce cascading effects. Each interaction was assessed for immediate and long-term impact, ensuring that movement toward independence remained safe and deliberate. Clarity regarding power, loyalty, and authority sharpened. These were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty was temporary, and obedience enforced under threat rather than principle. Recognizing these realities underscored the need for strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and ethical alignment could only be achieved through careful preparation, patience, and precise action. Endurance became essential. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to sustain survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became the primary tool, observation the weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of true courage. Acting decisively at the right moment transformed survival into autonomy. Decision-making reached critical intensity. Every interaction had consequences. Small actions could trigger outcomes affecting safety, autonomy, and long-term stability. Careful observation, assessment, and timing created opportunities for independence. Execution required precision, awareness, and restraint to minimize risk while maximizing control. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is determined not by aggression, intimidation, or force, but by awareness, discipline, patience, and foresight. True strength lies in the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under relentless pressure. The threshold of transformation approaches, and the possibility of independence is attainable for those who cultivate patience, observation, and disciplined action. The city was a maze of lights, shadows, and constant motion, yet the true activity was often hidden from view. For John Alite, the hours spent in careful observation became a study of human behavior, strategy, and survival. Every alley, every street corner, and every building carried the potential for danger or opportunity. Life in this world demanded more than courage. It demanded precision, patience, and a mind attuned to subtle cues that most would miss. In these hours, the rules of survival were sharpened, tested, and internalized. Power was elusive and fluid. Positions of authority could shift overnight, alliances were conditional, and respect was fragile. People who seemed untouchable could quickly find themselves undermined by subtle manipulation or internal conflict. Survival depended on understanding these dynamics, anticipating actions, and positioning oneself strategically. Strength alone was never sufficient. The key lay in observation, foresight, and disciplined execution. Awareness became the most valuable form of currency. Being seen carried inherent risk. Visibility drew scrutiny and responsibility, yet absence risked suspicion and exclusion. Every action, word, and interaction had to communicate neutrality while preserving control. Timing was everything. A premature move could provoke retaliation, while hesitation could result in missed opportunities. Balancing engagement with discretion was a delicate art, requiring constant evaluation and self-regulation. Each choice had immediate consequences and long-term implications. Observation was the most powerful skill in this environment. Every minor gesture, repeated routine, and subtle interaction provided insight into intentions, priorities, and vulnerabilities. Understanding why people acted in certain ways allowed Alite to anticipate outcomes, avoid danger, and act strategically. Knowledge became leverage, patience became a weapon, and timing became more important than influence, intimidation, or money. Each insight created a pathway toward autonomy while reducing exposure to harm. The psychological toll was relentless. Sleep was often shallow and fragmented. Even in rest, the mind remained active, analyzing, predicting, and recalibrating. Emotional strain accumulated silently, shaping instinct and guiding behavior. Fear, once paralyzing, became a tool to identify risk and refine strategy. Awareness replaced anxiety, guiding measured action rather than impulsive reaction. Survival required not only mental agility but emotional discipline, the ability to manage internal tension without compromising judgment. Financial resources offered no true protection. Wealth could attract attention, envy, and scrutiny, but it provided no safety from betrayal, miscalculation, or coercion. Alite understood that autonomy and survival could not be purchased. They were earned through awareness, preparation, and disciplined execution. True power came not from money, influence, or physical dominance, but from knowledge, patience, and the ability to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. Reflection became a constant companion. Every decision, every act of loyalty, and every compromise carried consequences that extended beyond immediate results. Moral awareness was essential. It guided decisions and shaped strategy. Recognizing the long-term impact of past actions informed present choices, emphasizing the need for careful, strategic disengagement. Continued immersion in a destructive system guaranteed erosion of identity, integrity, and independence, while deliberate withdrawal offered the possibility of preservation and freedom. Strategic patience became indispensable. Impulsive action was no longer effective. Timing and careful assessment dictated survival. Opportunities had to be observed and acted upon only when conditions were favorable. Premature action risked exposure, while delayed action risked missed chances. Patience became more valuable than aggression or dominance. Each choice required measured consideration, balancing immediate risk against long-term benefit. Precision became the foundation of safety and autonomy. The environment constantly tested resolve. Routine questions, minor provocations, and subtle challenges measured loyalty and reaction. Responding appropriately demanded neutrality without detachment, compliance without overcommitment, and observation without detection. Emotional composure became a defining skill, guiding safe navigation and preserving autonomy. Awareness and discernment became critical, ensuring that every step minimized risk while maintaining opportunity. Mental discipline became the cornerstone of survival. Every thought, word, and action carried potential consequences. Anticipating behavior, understanding motives, and adjusting responses accordingly determined safety and the potential for independence. Emotional mastery, more than physical strength, defined survival. Remaining calm, patient, and calculated under pressure allowed Alite to maintain control over his environment and protect both life and autonomy. Internal tension was a constant companion. Desire for autonomy, safety, and moral clarity competed with fear, obligation, and habit. Emotional detachment became necessary not as a lack of empathy, but as a strategy to preserve life and independence. Understanding the difference between necessary compliance and habitual indulgence allowed Alite to maintain control, protect integrity, and navigate complex social landscapes. Every choice became a deliberate act, balancing risk and opportunity. Physical awareness reinforced mental acuity. The body remained alert, trained to recognize even subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception intensified, and fatigue became a tool to enhance focus and readiness. Survival depended less on physical force and more on careful observation, timing, and strategic action. Every sensory input was processed, ensuring decisions were deliberate and informed. Awareness of surroundings was as crucial as any tactical skill. Preparation for disengagement grew increasingly precise. Social dynamics were studied, behavioral patterns mapped, and sequences of routine identified as opportunities for safe action. Every detail from positioning to timing was incorporated into a larger strategy to minimize exposure and protect autonomy. Knowledge, combined with patience, became actionable, providing clear pathways that could be executed safely. Even with meticulous preparation, the environment remained unforgiving. Small errors, hesitation, or perceived deviation could invite scrutiny or retaliation. Balancing engagement and detachment required constant recalibration. Emotional composure was essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could produce cascading consequences. Each interaction was analyzed for both immediate and long-term impact, ensuring careful movement toward independence. Clarity regarding power, authority, and loyalty became essential. These concepts were often illusory. Authority was situational, loyalty temporary, and obedience enforced under threat. Recognizing these truths highlighted the need for strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and moral alignment were attainable only through deliberate preparation, observation, and calculated execution. Endurance was paramount. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to ensure survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding every decision. Patience became a tool, observation a weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of courage. Acting decisively at the right moment transformed survival into autonomy and control. Decision-making reached heightened intensity. Every action had consequences, often extending far beyond immediate circumstances. Minor choices could trigger outcomes affecting safety, independence, and long-term stability. Careful observation, assessment, and timing created pathways toward independence. Execution required precision, awareness, and restraint to reduce risk and maximize control. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is dictated not by aggression or intimidation, but by awareness, discipline, patience, and foresight. True strength lies in the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under constant pressure. The threshold of transformation approaches, and freedom is within reach for those who cultivate patience, observation, and disciplined action. The city breathed with a rhythm all its own, a pulse that carried both promise and peril. Its streets, dimly lit and layered in shadow, offered lessons that could not be learned in daylight. For John Alite, the night revealed truths hidden in plain sight, patterns, behaviors, and opportunities that most people overlooked. In this environment, awareness was not optional. It was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Every detail mattered: a glance, a footstep, a tone of voice. Nothing could be taken for granted, and every observation became a piece of the larger puzzle. The structure of power in this world was subtle but relentless. Influence shifted with quiet gestures, alliances were conditional, and respect was fleeting. Those who appeared dominant could be undermined overnight through carefully orchestrated moves, whispered words, or unnoticed betrayals. Survival demanded not only courage, but the ability to read these shifts before they became threats. Strength without insight was useless, and visibility without strategy was fatal. Knowledge, patience, and foresight were the true currencies of power. Being seen was a calculated risk. Presence drew scrutiny and responsibility, while absence aroused suspicion and doubt. Each word, action, and gesture had to communicate neutrality, yet maintain influence and control. Timing determined whether a move would protect or expose. Acting too quickly could provoke retaliation, hesitating could allow opportunity to slip away. Balancing engagement with discretion was a constant negotiation, requiring acute awareness and unshakable self-control. Observation had become a lifeline. Every small motion, repeated pattern, and subtle expression provided insight into intentions and vulnerabilities. Understanding why people acted a certain way allowed Alite to predict outcomes and respond strategically. Knowledge became leverage. Patience became power. Timing became more valuable than influence, intimidation, or money. Each insight offered a step closer to autonomy and safety, while minimizing exposure to danger. The mental and emotional toll was relentless. Sleep was fragmented and often insufficient. Even in moments of rest, the mind remained alert, processing risk, evaluating interactions, and refining strategy. Emotional strain shaped instinct and guided decisions. Fear, once paralyzing, transformed into a guiding tool, highlighting risk and informing action. Awareness became a weapon, and inattention could lead to disaster. Survival required mental agility, emotional discipline, and an understanding of human nature. Financial security offered no real protection. Money could attract attention, envy, and scrutiny, but it could not safeguard against betrayal, miscalculation, or coercion. Alite understood that true safety was earned through preparation, observation, and disciplined execution. Autonomy depended not on wealth or intimidation, but on insight, patience, and the ability to act decisively in moments of opportunity. Strategic thinking outweighed material power. Reflection became an essential practice. Each decision, every compromise, and every act of loyalty carried consequences extending beyond the immediate moment. Moral awareness guided choices, influencing both behavior and strategy. Understanding the long-term impact of past actions allowed Alite to navigate a path toward independence. Continued engagement in destructive systems guaranteed erosion of identity, integrity, and autonomy. Strategic withdrawal offered the possibility of preservation, safety, and freedom. Patience was a critical tool. Impulsive decisions were no longer effective. Every move required assessment, observation, and precise timing. Acting too soon risked exposure or retaliation. Acting too late risked missed opportunities. Patience became more valuable than aggression or dominance. Each decision had to weigh immediate risk against long-term benefit, and precision became the foundation for both safety and autonomy. The environment constantly tested resilience. Routine questions, minor provocations, and subtle evaluations were designed to measure loyalty and character. Responding appropriately demanded neutrality without detachment, compliance without overcommitment, and observation without detection. Emotional composure was critical, guiding safe navigation while preserving autonomy. Awareness and discernment became indispensable, allowing action that minimized risk while maximizing opportunity. Mental discipline became central to survival. Every thought, word, and action carried potential consequences. Anticipating behavior, understanding motives, and adjusting responses defined both survival and the path toward autonomy. Emotional mastery, more than physical strength, became the foundation of security. Remaining calm, measured, and patient under pressure allowed Alite to maintain control over his environment, his decisions, and ultimately his independence. Internal tension was a constant companion. Desire for autonomy, moral clarity, and safety competed with fear, habit, and obligation. Emotional detachment was not coldness but strategy, a tool to preserve life, identity, and independence. Distinguishing necessary compliance from habitual indulgence allowed Alite to maintain integrity while navigating complex social dynamics. Every choice became a calculated measure of risk and opportunity, a deliberate act to protect autonomy and well-being. Physical awareness reinforced mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect subtle threats. Reflexes sharpened, perception heightened, and fatigue became a tool to increase focus. Survival depended less on force than on observation, timing, and precise action. Every sensory input contributed to decision-making, ensuring that choices were informed, deliberate, and safe. Awareness of surroundings became as essential as any tactical skill. Preparation for strategic disengagement continued meticulously. Social dynamics were analyzed, routines mapped, and predictable sequences identified as safe opportunities. Every detail from positioning to timing was incorporated into a broader strategy to minimize exposure and maximize autonomy. Knowledge, combined with patience, provided clear and actionable pathways that could be executed without unnecessary risk. Even with meticulous planning, the environment remained unforgiving. Minor errors, hesitation, or perceived deviation could provoke scrutiny or retaliation. Balancing engagement and detachment required constant adjustment. Emotional composure was essential. Acting too visibly or hesitating at critical moments could produce cascading consequences. Every interaction was evaluated for immediate and long-term implications, ensuring safe progress toward independence. Clarity about power, loyalty, and authority became essential. These concepts were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty temporary, and obedience enforced under threat rather than principle. Recognizing these truths emphasized the need for strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and moral alignment could only be achieved through deliberate preparation, careful observation, and precise action. Endurance became the defining quality. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to sustain survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became the primary tool, observation the weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of courage. Acting decisively at the right moment transformed survival into autonomy. Decision-making reached heightened intensity. Every interaction carried consequences, often extending far beyond immediate circumstances. Minor choices could trigger outcomes affecting safety, independence, and long-term stability. Careful observation, assessment, and precise timing created pathways to independence. Execution required awareness, restraint, and discipline to reduce risk and maximize control. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival is dictated not by aggression or intimidation, but by awareness, discipline, patience, and strategic foresight. True strength lies in the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under constant pressure. The threshold of transformation is near, and independence is within reach for those who cultivate patience, observation, and deliberate action. The city never truly rested, but the moments before dawn carried a stillness that revealed hidden truths. For John Alite, The hours were not quiet. They were a lens into the delicate machinery of human behavior, power, and survival. Every flicker of light, every echo of movement, every shadow contained information. In this world, nothing was trivial. Each observation, each choice, each calculated action shaped the difference between freedom and destruction. Living among danger demanded more than courage. It demanded patience, precision, and the ability to see clearly in a world designed to obscure. The nature of power remained constant, subtle, shifting, and unpredictable. Influence could be gained or lost through gestures too small for most to notice. Alliances were conditional, respect fleeting, and the facade of control often hid vulnerability. Those who appeared untouchable could crumble under quiet manipulation or unseen pressures. Survival depended not on aggression, physical dominance, or intimidation. It depended on knowledge, foresight, and strategic action. Understanding the nuances of human behavior became a necessity, a survival skill as vital as any weapon. Being observed carried inherent risk. To be seen was to invite scrutiny, yet to hide was to arouse suspicion. Every word, gesture, and movement had to balance neutrality with control. Timing dictated outcomes. Act too quickly, and consequences could be severe. Hesitate too long, and opportunity could vanish. Mastery of this balance required constant attention and self-discipline. Every interaction was a test. Every choice a decision with both immediate and long-term implications. Observation became John Alite's most valuable asset. Small gestures, repeated behaviors, and subtle interactions offered insight into intent, trustworthiness, and potential threat. Understanding motivations allowed him to anticipate moves, navigate danger, and act strategically. Knowledge became leverage. Patience became strength. Timing became more important than influence, money, or brute force. Each insight shaped the path toward autonomy, independence, and safety, reducing risk while revealing opportunity. The psychological demands were relentless. Sleep was irregular, often shallow and rarely restorative. Even during rest, the mind analyzed, predicted, and prepared. Emotional tension accumulated, shaping instincts and influencing decisions. Fear, once paralyzing, became an instrument of clarity, highlighting danger while guiding cautious, deliberate action. Awareness replaced panic. Every decision, no matter how small, required discipline, foresight, and emotional control. Survival was a balance of intellect, intuition, and composure under pressure. Financial security offered little true protection. Wealth could attract attention, envy, and scrutiny, but it could not shield against betrayal, miscalculation, or coercion. Alite recognized that autonomy and safety were earned through preparation, knowledge, and careful execution. Independence was not purchased, it was constructed through observation, patience, and deliberate action. True security relied on insight and strategy rather than material power. Reflection was a constant companion. Each choice, act of loyalty, and compromise carried consequences beyond the immediate moment. Moral awareness guided decisions, shaping both behavior and long-term strategy. Understanding the ramifications of past actions informed present decisions, and highlighted the importance of deliberate disengagement from harmful systems. Continued immersion guaranteed erosion of identity, integrity, and freedom while strategic. Withdrawal offered the chance for preservation and life restored to one's own design. Patience became the defining skill. Impulsivity was a liability. Precise timing was everything. Opportunities had to be observed and measured, acted upon only when conditions aligned favorably. Premature action risked exposure and retaliation. Hesitation risked missed opportunity. Patience, coupled with calculated observation, became more powerful than aggression, force, or intimidation. Each choice was an exercise in deliberate calculation, weighing short-term consequences against long-term benefit. The environment was a constant test of resolve. Routine provocations, minor questions, and subtle manipulations measured loyalty, character, and composure. Responding appropriately demanded neutrality without disengaging, compliance without overcommitment, and observation without revealing vulnerability. Emotional discipline guided safe navigation, preserving autonomy and survival. Awareness and discernment allowed movement that minimized risk while maximizing opportunity. Mental discipline defined survival. Every thought, word, and action had consequences. Anticipating behavior, understanding motives, and adjusting responses determined both immediate safety and the potential for long-term independence. Emotional mastery became more important than physical power. Calm, measured, and deliberate responses allowed Alite to maintain control, protecting life integrity and the possibility of freedom. Internal tension persisted. The desire for autonomy, moral clarity, and personal safety competed with fear, obligation, and habitual patterns. Emotional detachment was a necessary tool, not coldness. It preserved life, identity, and independence. Differentiating necessary compliance from habitual indulgence allowed Alite to maintain control, protect integrity, and navigate dangerous social landscapes. Each choice was deliberate, balancing risk against opportunity. Physical awareness complemented mental acuity. The body remained alert, conditioned to detect subtle danger. Reflexes sharpened, perception intensified, and fatigue became a tool for maintaining focus and vigilance. Survival depended less on strength and more on observation, timing, and strategic execution. Each sensory input was incorporated into decisions, ensuring that action was informed and deliberate. Awareness became as critical as strategy itself. Preparation for disengagement became meticulous. Social dynamics were studied, routines mapped, and patterns identified as opportunities for safe action. Every detail from positioning to timing was integrated into a broader strategy, designed to minimize risk and maximize autonomy. Knowledge and patience combined to create actionable pathways toward freedom. Even with preparation, the environment was unforgiving. Minor missteps, hesitation, or deviations could provoke scrutiny or retaliation. Balancing engagement and detachment required continuous adjustment. Emotional composure and neutrality were critical. Acting too visibly or hesitating at the wrong moment could trigger a cascade of consequences. Each interaction was evaluated for its immediate and long-term impact, ensuring safe progress toward independence. Clarity regarding power, loyalty, and authority sharpened. These concepts were often illusions. Authority was situational, loyalty temporary, and obedience enforced under threat. Recognizing these truths emphasized the necessity of strategic withdrawal. Freedom, safety, and ethical integrity were achievable only through deliberate preparation, careful observation, and precise action. Endurance became paramount. Mental resilience, emotional discipline, and physical readiness combined to sustain survival. Fear and awareness coexisted, guiding decisions. Patience became the primary tool, observation the weapon, and strategic restraint the measure of courage. Acting decisively at the right moment transformed survival into autonomy, independence, and control over one's life. Decision-making reached its apex. Every action carried consequences that could ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Minor choices could trigger outcomes affecting safety, autonomy, and long-term stability. Observation, assessment, and precise timing created pathways toward freedom. Execution required awareness, restraint, and discipline, maximizing control while reducing exposure. The lesson became undeniable. Survival is not measured by intimidation, force, or aggression. It is measured by awareness, discipline, patience, and foresight. True strength is the ability to navigate fear, act decisively, and preserve autonomy under constant pressure. Freedom, once earned, becomes a reflection of strategy, observation, and disciplined action. Independence is the ultimate achievement of careful choices, measured patience, and unwavering clarity of purpose. In the stillness of the early morning, as the first rays of light cut through the cityscape, John Alite recognized the truth that defined his journey. Life is a series of choices, and survival is not about power over others. It is about power over oneself. The ability to remain disciplined, patient, and aware, to understand human behavior, and to act decisively in alignment with one's own moral compass defines true strength. Every decision, every observation, and every act of patience builds a foundation for a life of autonomy, freedom, and purpose. The city would continue its rhythm, shadows would shift, and opportunities and dangers would emerge again, as they always had. But the lesson endured. Clarity, patience, and strategic awareness transform fear into insight, risk into opportunity, and survival into a life lived on one's own terms. True independence is not given, it is earned, crafted through observation, foresight, and the courage to act deliberately and wisely.